Okay, good morning or good afternoon. It's 12:30. I feel like it's still the morning. This is the Summer Government Accountability Committee. And we have one of our members online, Josie, Representative Levitt. And we are waiting for two of our members who are on their way. But we do have a quorum, so we can get started. And we have a lot of it's on our agenda today. So I just wanted to mention that there was a last minute change. It's been updated online, but we have a 3 o'clock to add to the agenda. Susanna Davis, who is the director, I believe, is it a director?
Executive Director.
Executive Director of the Office,
Racial
Racial Equity Office, who is going to come and talk to us more about in Act 53, the section C, powers and duties, but 2, 3, and 4. We've spent most of our time talking about 1. And that's what the recommendations that we're going to review today, that I've just what I did was go through and listen to our meetings again and tried to capture what everyone said. And then my conversations with Senator Brock and just tried to put it all in one place so we'd have something to start with and to react to. And then we're also hearing today from the National Council of State Legislators who are going to talk with us a bit about those same 2, 3, and 4, which I'm kind of calling the equity questions, is going to talk to us about what other states are doing in order to meet some of those, to answer some of those questions. And then we're going to hear from Catherine Benham from Joint Fiscal. And she's also going to do sort of current practices, what happens already. Okay, we have another one of our members here with us now. Senator Hasnick's here. So thank you and welcome. Thank you. And so then we're going to hear from Joint Fiscal about what they're currently doing that might be helpful in the vein of accountable government. And she may have some recommendations for us as well. Spring equity in Act 53. And I also just wanted to say that the recommendations, everyone should have one. Does everyone have one? No, it's right there, as well as agendas. But the one that was sent to you, we updated it this morning and tried to make it easier to read. Thank you, Tim, from Ledge Council, who took all that I had sort of just rambled on and put it all in a format that's easier to read for all of us so we can kind of go point by point together and not just be saying on page 2, third bullet down. You know? So
if we have time before Catherine gets here, can we review our powers and duties quickly?
Yes,
again? Is that
absolutely. I have it right in front of me. Do you have yours too?
No, I'm pulling it up.
But let's do that. That sounds great. So, and we have time because we're a little bit ahead of schedule here. It's really Act 53 is it sunsets all kinds of things that were a part of the Sunset Commission. But the section that matters to us here is section 2, which is the intent of the General Assembly that the House Committee on Government Operations, Military Affairs, and Senate Committee on Government Operations should re-examine the principle of government accountability with a focus on how evidence is used to inform policy, how information is publicly conveyed, and the committees should propose statutory, or the committee, it says the committees, should propose, that means the House and Senate Government Operations Committees, should propose statutory amendments as needed to accomplish those goals. And so then section 2A goes into the creation, the membership, which we know was the Senate Pro Tem appointed 4 members and the Speaker appointed 4 members. And then under C, which I think is the important part here, is powers and duties. The Summer Government Accountability Committee shall consider the issue of accountability in the legislative branch, including the following. And this has been a big issue. This morning, I talked with both Susanna Davis and Justin Kenny, who is the Chief Performance Officer for the state. So works essentially in the governor's office. And he used to be a member, sort of an ex officio member, I believe, but they did vote as part of our Government Accountability Committee meetings of the past. But we didn't do it that way here because this is more truly about government accountability in the legislative branch. And that most of what he's responsible for is collecting the data to fill in the I lost
Those reports.
yeah, the outcomes report and check, to check off boxes and all of those sort of things. We actually had a great conversation this morning about how much more they are doing now, that they've really evolved. And at some point, he would love an opportunity to either talk with us about that. And also he wants to be sure that he wants to be sure that when our recommendations go to the government operations committees that are the policy committees, that he has an opportunity to discuss and work with them as well. And so I assured him that we would do that. And Susanna Davis is coming today to be able to get to, let's go to the number two, what she wants to get to. So the powers and duties, the first thing is ways to ensure that the legislative branch is accountable to the people of Vermont by creating new processes and metrics by which to measure accountability.
And that's where we spent most of our time.
That's all of our time so far. Yeah. And we talked about it at the first meeting, that with 3 meetings, there was no way we were going to be able to get to 2, 3, and 4, which seemed to be sort of grouped in many ways. A lot of those questions are similar in nature. And so we asked the speaker and the president pro tem if we could add committee meetings to have more time. And unfortunately, we did get one more meeting, but we still had so much work to do in this area. And I think we could be here for an entire year working on number 1, and we probably still wouldn't have exactly what we all would hope to have. So what we thought is that 2, 3, and 4 could be recommendations they could go to government operations. And if they really felt that they wanted this committee to work on that, then this committee's work could be moved forward to have more meetings at that point. Interestingly, the speaker felt strongly that she just wanted to make sure that we at least have 1 or 2 recommendations with regard to 2, 3, and 4. And so that's when I reached out a couple of weeks ago to NCSL to ask them to come and talk to us about what's going on in other states. And then today I talked to Susanna, who would really like an opportunity to talk with us about sort of setting the stage for the government operations committees. So she is going to come today, and she's also going to come to our 4th meeting, and she's going to talk more about that. So what are those? 2, ways to ensure equity in pay across commissions, boards, and joint legislative committees based on the nature of the service and required skill level. And this one, what's interesting is Susanna Davis told me today that there are 2 other summer committees that are working on this as well. Mm-hmm. So she's going to talk with us about that too. And then 3 is ways to ensure equitable participation on boards and commissions and in any public engagement process mandated by the state or General Assembly by providing appropriate compensation and material support. And then 4 is codifying mechanisms for controlling and restraining the increasing number of commissions, boards, and joint legislative committees. And I would say, as far as 4 goes, there was a sunset commission that had been created, I think, 2 years ago. It was longer than that. It was 4 years ago. And that committee is what was sunsetted in Act 53 because they did their work, sunsetted a bunch of committees and commissions and so forth. And now we were created because the government operations committees were going to sunset us and then they were going to do the work we're doing right now, but they never got to it. And felt that it was so important that we not lose the government operations piece that they added section 2 in to have us begin that work and pass on our recommendations to them. So that's sort of a recap of how this happened.
And recently I've seen that whenever new boards or commissions are created, there's an attempt to put a sunset into those boards or commissions. And I always think of that as like the Gannon provision.
Yes.
Because John Gannon was like, I feel like the only person who was really like very excited about this project of a number of boards and commissions and made something of a project of it.
Yes, that is absolutely true. He was in the Government Operations Committee his first term, and that was my first term. And we had every bill that we looked at that year had a new committee, commission, something in it. And so somewhere towards the end of the session, our chair, who was then Maida Townsend, Representative Townsend from South Burlington, she said, you know, we probably should look more seriously at how these are created and whether or not they should be sunsetted. And so first she just had Representative Gannon and Representative Kitzmiller as a little sub-team go off and do some research. And that's when they realized how huge that project could be. And so it turned into another committee, but we called it a sunset committee in order to reduce, to go through and reduce. And it's funny how committees that hadn't met in years would come to the committee, the Sunset Commission, and they would have to explain, you know, you haven't met in a really long time. Do you really think, would you be interested in having this committee or commission sunsetted? And most of them didn't want to. So it was interesting. So anyway, I think that's when he wrote his legislation that said, when you put a committee or a commission into a bill, you need to sunset it so that we can at least review whether or not it should be there, which is all part of government accountability, right? And
Yeah.
Well, given the number of people who are on boards and commissions, which is an absolutely astounding number, one of the ways we could limit it is by limiting service that no Vermonter could serve on more than one board or commission, and that would limit the total number.
The grinding halt.
Yeah, definitely. Interesting idea. But we'll hear a little more about that today, for sure. But right now, we have Catherine Benham, who's here from the Joint Fiscal Office, and we're very excited that you're here with us. A little bit. Do you know everyone? Should we introduce?
Sure, I'm Catherine Benham with the Joint Fiscal Office and I do Wendy Harris.
Yes.
Met
Oh, okay. Good.
orientation. We
And on the our TV screen there is Representative Levitt, Josie Levitt from Grand Isle.
Grand Isle Chittenden. Nice to meet you.
nice to meet you.
Great. Okay, well, we're excited to hear. We heard, as you know, we heard from Jen Carby from Ledge Council last time about sort of what's already happening that is sort of part of the process in order to get ready for each legislative session. And wanted to hear the same from Joint Fiscal and any recommendations you might have for us.
Thank you. Again, Catherine Benham, Chief Fiscal Officer with the Joint Fiscal Office. And I appreciate that lead, and I will admit I have not had time. I have not watched Jen, but I talked to Jen about what she presented. And so I have prepared some talking points for me to talk through. And I had some big picture. I was going to talk about some big picture thoughts before I got into what we specifically do. And I focused on my glasses. You know, these things are, they go to sunglasses and they're not going back.
Our lights.
I know. Do you want some reading glasses first? Well, I should ask you how strong they are. There we go. Perfect. And so I focused on You're number one, the ways to ensure the legislative branch is accountable. So that was the charge I was looking at. And I want to lead with, I think there is value, a lot of value in understanding program evaluation and effectiveness. I think I agree with that, and we're working from that premise. I've got sort of three big picture thoughts. One is the legislative side. There is so much turnover in the legislature. Right. I know there was a lot this year and there was a lot prior, and there's always big turnover. And so you constantly have new legislators that need to be educated about what it is we're doing and what the effectiveness is. And that's a big part of this as well. I think that there's a lot going on for new legislators, and it's just it's one more thing for them to absorb, but I think it's important. It is, and to understand how things are currently being measured and what tools are already in place. So, and the other thing I think about is that the budget committee has to deal with the whole package of things and do with the trade-offs of various pieces, but individual policy committees are dealing with their particular area and subject, are not having to make those trade-offs. And so one of the things to think that's hard for people to understand sometimes is you are going to have to choose something over something else. And so thinking about the effectiveness is important. And I think that is a hard thing to grasp, especially when you're new in the legislature and when you haven't had the context of all the other choices that are being made. So I would just say we need to think about how we promote and use evaluation and how we teach new legislators about it, and continue to be thoughtful about reports and that are required, because we ask for a lot of reports and some of them are read and some of them are not read. And so that trying to, remind people what information we already have available is important. Anyway, so that's sort of the big legislative side. The next one I want to talk about was the context. I think you need context when you look at when you're evaluating projects and programs, because a specific target or measure doesn't really tell the full story. We've got, data. First of all, Vermont is small and data samples are small. And so sometimes you actually can't tell anything from Vermont data because we don't have enough data to really measure and to know what's going on. Also things change quickly. There's a flood, there's COVID, and a lot of times we're measuring things. We're using data that's old because that's what we have, 2-year-old data. So it's not always, the data we have is not always necessarily appropriate for the moment we're in. And, just managing people's expectations about what the data can do or not do. I would also say when you measure programs, you have to remember that people, collectively, we don't always fund things the way we statutorily have said we should. The property transfer tax is one example where we say notwithstanding other things like that. So when you measure the effectiveness of a program, you also have to keep in mind, have we funded it to the level that we meant to fund it at, or anticipated funding it? And so if you don't fund it, how do you measure success? If you have, and it's a challenge in many places, and we're always going to have limited resources. So how do you really measure success when you may not have put all the funding in that you would have liked? The other thing, which I'll get in more when we talk about what our office does, but issue briefs and studies, the world is complicated. And I think you need the context of it's not just always a simple measurement. Yes, we've done X number, we've processed this number of claims. You actually might want to know a little bit more about the context of whatever it is you're measuring. And so I will, for example, in our office, we do issue briefs, and I will talk more about that in a minute. But having the bigger context is important when you think about measuring programs for success. The final point on the big picture is the executive branch. You've got to have them bought into it and using it. That is, if you really want to be effective, if they're using it, they're the ones who have to implement it. They're the ones who implement the program. If it's a collective buy-in to whatever the measurement is, that will make a world of difference in whether or not it's used and is effective. And so, one thought is you ask agencies what they're using to measure their own success. That is one place to start. And how do they use them? Again, using reports that we already have in place. And finally, I was going to say the Appropriations Committee has these questions to ask. They put out a letter to all the departments before they come in. And they say, here, when you come, please, and on the budget, please talk about these things. And they have 3 questions. How much did we do? How well did we do it? And is anyone better off? And those, I think, cover a lot of what people are thinking about when they want to think about program effectiveness. It may not capture everything, but they're important questions. If we were all collectively using those questions, if those are the questions that we all, when I say we, I mean the legislature and the state or whatever who agreed to, then if we all keep using them, that will be easier to educate people on their simple questions. And they also sort of get to the heart of the matter. And there are different ways. How much did we do? That's a question. There's different ways to measure how much we do. So anyway, those are sort of the big contexts. And in segueing now into the Joint Fiscal Office, I would say some of the ways that we help the legislature are we help craft letters like this budget letter that goes out to everybody, where you're getting information, trying to help the committees that we serve answer those questions when they get that information. The legislature's also required the administration to develop performance measures on their own already. And there are some that are in the budget submissions. So like Forest Parks and Recreation has a thing at the back of their budget book. They have a measurement on volunteers. They have a measurement on volunteer hours, number of visits. Oh, I didn't finish the sentence. It was number of roadside. What is the tree that is, there's some tree that is struggling. It has a lot of disease.
Emerald ash, the ash tree.
The ash tree.
Yeah.
They have a measurement on the ash tree road, and I can't remember if it's the number of roadside ash trees they've looked at or reviewed but they have these measurements. I know other departments also have them. I just used that one for an example, but they already have those. I don't know if those are the right ones that everybody would pick, but they have, it's kind of interesting actually to look at which ones they were picking up.
That's our business studies work. Yeah, that's outcomes report, essentially. That's all encapsulated in.
Yeah. So those, there's some interesting information there, I would say. The other thing is the Senate and House passed bills. If you look at when you all get the budget like the budget summary document on the floor, the House and Senate are somewhat, they look different, but in fact, they cover like principles. And there's things like that the Appropriations Committee says, like, have we met our reserves? Have we prioritized essential services and critical infrastructure? Our base commitments honored. There's that piece that is, and that's where we help, I would say as a fiscal office, we help the committees think about those questions as the Appropriations Committee, as they process the budget and making sure what have they prioritized. So for example, reserves would be a high priority, clearly from my perspective. I like to have full reserves. And is that an accountability that may not be the accountability that you all are talking about, but it's an important fiscal accountability piece in my mind. There's also a report on unfunded budget pressures that the administration gives to us. And these are areas that are not receiving funds that are supposed to be funded at whatever level, and then for whatever reason they're not. So the property transfer tax, the pensions have been on the list. It's not actually a very long report, but it's an interesting one because it touches on some big areas. But that's another thing as you think about accountability. We have some things that we are not meeting what we said we would do. And so what do you do with that? On the revenue side, some of the things, so I would say the Joint Fiscal Office helps in the budget process and thinking through all of those issues and how do you think about what you're funding and not funding. And that is where the budget documents is an area where we assist the legislature in figuring out its priorities and measuring program effectiveness and trying to make choices. On the revenue side, we have the tax expenditure report, which details where we provided tax expenditures. And there's a report on sort of all of the major ones. And then we do a deep dive on some individual ones. So that gives you insight into where places you have collectively decided to provide tax credits or whatever it is that you've done on those fronts. And then now generally the fiscal notes, we do fiscal notes on bills, which is, helps you think about what some of the costs. I would say also there are issue briefs, which are a broader topic, and they're on areas of issues that are coming up in a variety of places. So we did one recently on what if the federal government shuts down. So it's not on related to a specific bill or necessarily anything that's actually right in front of you right this minute, but it's about a topic that's going to impact Vermont in some way. Another one was, I was going to talk about, we have the population estimates by age group, 2010 to 2021, like the population, what our age cohorts are doing. Thinking about healthcare claims tax summary or the criminal justice revenues, things like that. Those are just some examples. So they're broad topics, but they're information that I think is relevant for thinking about how you prioritize and move forward, what you want to fund, what programs are succeeding, doing what you want, or related considerations to think about. So anyway, I'm a big fan of those for a lot of reasons. And then we have reports and studies, and most of those are requirements that legislation is called for. So the RAND study on childcare or a report on other things we do, the basic needs budget, there are other reports like that we do as well. So those are resources that are available to the legislature to think about various programs or topics. And thinking about the long term. So one option I know that has been discussed is that creating an evaluation office, a legislative evaluation office, or that some states have had that, or you could put it in other places. And it's certainly a consideration. I've been part of conversations about it for probably for many years, I should say. And it's an interesting idea. It will require staffing. It will require, that will require money. So it's something that is a consideration about the trade-offs, how you want to move forward, and who would have that on, where would that be placed in the state government? And how do you fund it and how big do you make it? And those are all thoughts. I think you'd have to be careful about this, what the goal of the office is, be very clear about what it is that you're charging that particular group with, what their mission is. In the shorter term, I think going back to sort of what I led with, promoting legislative understanding of the importance of evaluation would be good. I don't think everybody understands that evaluation is important, and finding a way to get legislators to think about it and setting up it systematically. So when the new legislators come in, they get exposed to that concept also would be a useful piece of this process. Again, understanding the limitations of the data. And then thinking about evaluations in a productive way, working with the executive branch so that they buy into it and agree and support it, because that's where you will actually have it make a difference, I believe. And being mindful of all the other things that you've charged the agencies and departments with, because there's a lot. Some of them are doing a lot. And then I still like coming back to the 3 questions. How much do we do? How well did we do it? Is anyone better off? And those are, maybe you may come up with a different set of questions, but those, I think, get at the heart of what you're trying to do, or what we're all trying to do here. So those are my.
There's question. Can I just just a note? Also, you do fiscal notes.
Oh, well, the fiscal notes, yes. And the other thing is the fiscal notes and you all may not read it, but the fiscal facts book. I said you're right. I forgot that one because I use that one a lot. I love that one. And there's a few pages I use it a lot for, but thank you for that reminder. Sorry.
Oh my goodness, I have so many ideas and questions.
The first one is I'm thinking about the tax expenditure report, which is important to me.
And I fairly,
And what's interesting about it is I think it is sort of in some ways
exactly is in some ways an example of exactly how we systematized this thing that we talk about, like an area of statute that we revisit very regularly, that we clearly have named the intent for in statute. And then we get this regular report that says, are we meeting the intent for the amount of money we're losing on this activity?
Can you
And
explain?
I'll explain it one second. And then we always go over it in a committee. It's like a built-in part of the agenda, at least on the House side, and I think always has been. So the tax expenditure report is basically like anything that's a tax expenditure. It's usually like tax credits or tax refunds or like anything that costs the state money because of revenue we're not bringing in statute.
Okay.
And then in statute, any tax expenditure actually has to have an intent for it. It's like a part of the process of creating a tax expenditure, which is not true for your average bill. In fact, we often don't use intent sections in bills. And so it means that JFO is like, has an easier time saying like, are we actually fulfilling the legislatively stated goal of this spending activity?
So this is costing us money. Let's go back and look, is it worth it? Because the intent was this. So do they meet? Okay.
Yeah. And so it's like a very, and so there's like that, there's also like a very clear tradition in committee of taking the time with JFO, who has taken the time to do the work. And so it's a report that is like very systematized and acted on for the most part.
Yeah.
And so it's in some ways a perfect model of what we're talking about, but there are so many steps in it. There's the fact that like statute reminds us to always put in an intent. And council always does that in these cases. That's a huge one, right? So there's like the initial flag. There's the fact that there's staffing to actually do the research. There's a report that's delivered to a committee that's actually primed to pay attention to that report.
Yes, these are structural things.
There are like, there's like 5 different structural pieces that actually makes it work. And at the end of the day, there are some tax expenditures that we have that are clearly not meeting their statutory goals that everyone just has feelings about. And so we keep them around. So it's still like not a perfect system. I won't get into which those are.
Oh, why not?
But I think in some ways it's a really nice model to just even ask ourselves, like, what are ways we could sort of extend those ways that works into other places? I'm curious about, for things like the issue brief or the tax expenditure report. You said that we need administrative buy-in for things like that to sort of go as well as we want measurement to go well. But I'm curious, are there places in state government where that we could change something so that JFO would have a greater eyes on an issue to be able to do that work? Are there places that sometimes us not having agreement between branches of government keeps JFO from being able to get the information they need to even just give us the information to even do the analysis?
It's a great question. I'm not coming up with an example off the top of my head, but I think it's interesting about not having intent. If it's not clear why you want something, the goal is to avoid let's use the ash trees, right? The ash trees we want to protect them all. That is simpler than, I don't know. There's different, if you're very clear about the goal, why is Forest and Parks why are they measuring how many ash trees they're checking? I think it was checking, I don't remember. And so I don't know what the goal was for that, but so they can provide that information, but in fact, the goal was to save the trees. Yeah, I don't know, do something else. And so I think getting to your point about intent is really actually a really interesting one about it. What is the legislative intent for each, the bills I look at, it's interesting, the bills I look at often have intent because maybe I'm looking at the bigger, like the childcare, I'm thinking about the big bills, but maybe some smaller bills don't have intent all the time. And maybe that's an interesting point about being clear.
Yes.
I would just follow up, the housing bill didn't have as much intent as it could have, is just follow up to that. And just another follow-up, does your office have access to all of the financial, I guess, really transactions?
We can, the answers we have access to a lot. Do we have access to all? I don't know. I'd have to check on that. But people were, people, when we ask people for information, I would say agencies give us information.
Okay.
Especially if it's publicly available. If there's some confidential stuff, you think they don't.
No, I think sometimes it takes months too.
Yeah.
Yes, and sometimes the data is not actually even available. So I'm going to use an example that you're going to hear about later. The ARPA funding, how much has been spent. They issued a report that in the accounting system, there is a report. It shows you how much money has left the state coffers. What it doesn't show you well is how much is encumbered or about to be encumbered or being granted out. And so different departments do that interim process differently. So you can't actually get a snapshot from just going in the financial system. There's an example of where you have to have the context. So I know this much is gone, boom, it's out very clearly out of the books. I don't know for the part that isn't spent, how much is actually, I know some of it's encumbered and I can tell you that, but there's actually others that looks like it's not encumbered that actually is encumbered or about to be encumbered. And the grant program's been written and people are applying. And so it's going to be, so the financial system provides some information, but it doesn't provide all of it. And because there was just a report on how much ARPA money has been spent or not spent, but it is of limited value. It's of some value, but limited. And so I think Representative Coinars was right. Sometimes it does take a long time to get information, and sometimes it's because it's not easily available, or and sometimes people maybe they don't want to share it. And sometimes it's not their top priority. I would say also it will require a lot of work, and it's just not their top priority. And so how do you make it their top priority? The tax expenditure one is also very interesting because we have a strong working relationship with the tax department, and it's clear what we have to do. And we do have this established system where we're doing this report and we're going to come back and everybody just knows it. It's a great example from that perspective.
Is one, and that is much of the work that you do relates to expenses, financial information of agencies within the executive branch. To what extent do you touch the judiciary?
We touch them we touch some of it on the fees. For example, the judicial fees, they're on the IT projects that they do is one other example. On the budget, they come through the appropriations committees, but I will just say in the context of the whole state budget, both the judiciary and legislative branches are pretty small, relatively small portion of all the spending that goes on. So we touch them in those ways, but the fees and the IT projects are the ones I can most recently think about that got more attention than sort of your typical budget process work.
So I have a couple. On the fiscal notes, do you have, if someone comes to you wanting, or a committee, it's usually a committee, I'm assuming that you can't, do individual legislators ask for a fiscal note?
Well, people do all the time. We do fiscal notes that are moving. So we don't have the staffing to do a fiscal note on every bill. We do fiscal notes on bills that are moving and going to money committees.
Okay.
And they may or may not survive that venue, but they're moving along. They're not just sitting on the wall somewhere.
So it's not
It's
based.
usually a money committee's going to pick the bill up.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And so sometimes we get out ahead of it because we know it's going to come. So we prepare it before it gets to, for example, Ways and Means or appropriations. But that's sort of our trigger for when we take it on and work on it.
Right. I mean, I'm mostly looking, the reason I asked that question is I'm just thinking even about if we did performance notes, would we do it based on once you hit a certain threshold dollar wise, now you can get a fiscal note or now you can get a performance note, or I'm not sure, but that's why I asked that question. I wondered if we set any decision on whether or not to have any sort of help based on dollars, how many dollars are spent on that bill.
We do it based on whether it's.
It's limited.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
But it's a good point about if you're going to do an evaluation, if you asked us to do a fiscal note on every bill, I would need to hire a lot more people.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of bills that don't move. So the same thing with evaluation, if you end up creating some sort of evaluation process, you need to have some parameters on which programs get to be evaluated. And I don't know that you want to do a dollar amount because some small things really matter to people.
Yeah.
And yet you also don't want to have to staff up to cover absolutely every program. And so figuring out how you prioritize the programs to evaluate would be important.
Yeah, I mean, did you have a follow up on that?
I have a yeah on that one.
Okay.
I think we can have, especially GovOps and judiciary. And there are a lot of committees that do like incredibly impactful bills and could do that actually don't cost any money at all, that would transform the life of everyone in the state. And so having a performance note on that might make sense because but even though there might not be very dollars.
Yeah, that makes sense. Good, that's helpful. And the other question I have is a little different. It's about the budget. When you're preparing the appropriations committees to ask questions of the departments who bring in their budgets and the policy committee. So I'm on a policy committee. We also are asking, and it is an intense time for our state workers because they're having to prepare material for many people. And it's all about where are you in which ones should we prioritize and not prioritize. But one of the things that's hard is that sometimes you hear a lot about money being dropped to the bottom and then moved. And then it's hard to evaluate that with those three questions, right? How much? Of course.
How well?
How well? Is anyone better off,
Yeah.
right? And yet I do think that we as policy committees and the appropriations committee, especially more recently, really are asking those questions in their questions. But then they end up with whoever comes in to present it, coming in and spending a lot of time talking about what they're doing, but not really reacting to what happened in the budget, what we approved the year before to be spent. So we're hearing about programs, we're not totally sure they're connected to the money that we put aside the year before. Do you know? And I just am curious if you have any ideas on how structurally to help that a little bit. It's,
So for example, you funded a particular program last year and then they've come in, they're talking about next, but you're like, did you actually do that program? Did you?
The New Mexico fiscal director described it basically as the administration like filibustering in their presentations. And I think that resonated for everyone.
All of us.
on that in the committee.
Yeah. Did they have an answer for in New Mexico for how
They
to?
created this whole amazing office
Yeah.
that sits in their fiscal office.
And did that solve everything? There's no more filibustering?
I think it's helped a lot of it.
Yeah. Yeah, because now they don't come in and just do what they want to do. They really do. They're being forced to respond. It seems to me like part of it is that they take more time looking at the budget from the year before and really putting in categories what we approved. And then their questions are coming based on that versus based on a new budget that we're working on this year. So they're really looking back and their questions are there in order to then be ready
And to inform the budget.
to inform this year's budget, I'm just trying to figure out how to get my arms around that. Like, what could we do structurally?
Well, what a lot of towns do is you don't just look at last year's because last year's is actually, you're in it now, right? You're in last year's.
Years ago.
So do the actual from 2 years ago, where you anticipate being, which is really helpful for this year and then next year. And then also talk about trends in not just the finances, but in what you're doing. I think that can be very helpful. I think we could do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's because we're building the legislative budget right now and we're doing exactly that. Like we're trying, as you build out, you're looking back, it's less about program evaluation and more about just for us in this, in the legislature just trying to budget with those three. We have those three columns of data.
And I know we're running out of time. Just two things. One, the way that they do that in New Mexico with that staff is essentially the staff spend a lot of time prepping with the administration. And
Yeah.
in order for them to be prepared to answer very specific and explicit questions that are sort of framed up by that fiscal office.
They also have much shorter sessions, don't
They
they?
do also, there's also like all kinds of power differences and such
Yeah,
short
yeah,
sessions
yeah,
and all those things. Yes, yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Sort of separately, so this whole question of is, how much are we doing, how well are we doing, is anyone better off? I think is really helpful as our fiscal notes. But in both cases, it's looking at each individual thing in a vacuum. And I think you were touching on this, Jessica. And no one is looking at how are all of these different things connected to each other. And I think in some ways, your office has the best global view, but we don't have any structures in place to look globally, really, except for the sort of the trade-offs in the budget. But the trade-offs in the budget wind up being sort of globally about dollars, not globally about impacts. We only talk about impacts in the micro instead of the macro. And I feel like there must be a structure for doing it in the macro internally within the legislature, separate from
This is exactly
the
what I'm
performance.
getting at. Thank
Yeah,
you for
sure.
saying it in a more clear way.
No, it's you're just saying something a second time, actually, in the exact same way is what helps. And so that's sort of, that's, I think, was the hope of Act 186. But it became also very micro because it's like just data and no one really thinks about the data. So that's sort of just something maybe to give some thought to long term.
That's what I was,
How even your office could be taking a step back more often to look globally. I think you take a step back to look deep often, and that's what the issue briefs are.
Yep.
But a step back to look globally.
yeah, I agree. And I would love for you to just kind of Google that or whatever the right word is for a little bit. And if something pops in, like, this might be a way to get at that for legislators. One of the ways that we are getting at that, I'll say, is that if you're a legislator who has sat on a policy committee for a while, you know what the processes are, right? You know that we're going to do budget adjustment and we're going to do budget. And so for example, I've been on human services for a while. So I write in my notes at the end of the budget year, the things that I want to know about for next year. And those are my questions so that it doesn't just get lost in, well, we dropped that to the bottom line and now it's in transportation. Instead, okay, why? Why didn't you spend all the money in Reach Up? Because I know there were plenty of people that needed that money. So that's the kind of thing. But if I'm gone, no one's going to have all my questions the year after. And so because we turn over, as 40 to 60 of us every 2 years, it's hard to stay on top of that. So I'm looking for like a structural way.
The other challenge, which I forgot to mention earlier, is if advocates don't always like the answers that you get. And so that's also pushing back on it, whatever you end up using, because it doesn't speak to whatever they're pushing for. It's a hard conversation. And you have a lot of new legislators who don't know it. I'm intrigued by both the tax expenditure systemized, and thinking more globally. There is also, the other challenge is this legislature spends a lot of time in committee doing a lot of work, and that's not true in other states. The staff do a lot more of it. And so I'm reflecting on New Mexico because they clearly rely on the staff to do a lot of background work and get it ready in a way that you all actually do in person. And you do have these administration people having to go to several committees and explain the topic. And is it perfect for them? No. And it also does allow more people to understand what they're doing, and it gets more people in the conversation talking about whatever it is they're doing. But it's, I don't know what the right balance is. I will think about it.
Yeah, it can make for better policy. Sorry.
We obviously, I think, do a lot better job looking backwards than we do looking forward. Because we can go back and we can measure and we can count and we can evaluate. One of the things, though, that is important that I look to JFO a lot to help with is as legislation is being proposed that will do something in the future, particularly things that will save money, that will result in something that's beneficial, how comfortable are you that you have the tools necessary to be able to do that, to help us towards that end? And I'm thinking of a couple of bills in particular, as we're looking at things like, do we create a film commission in order to help the film industry? If so, what will that produce? Will it pay for itself? And how do we get a handle on measuring that? The second would be on things like remove the taxation on military retirement, because it will encourage more military retirees who will stay here, to come here with their families, and will add to that. How well do you feel that JFO is able to address those kinds of issues?
I think we're as able to address them as anybody would, given the time constraints we've got sometimes on these. I mean, the film commission, whatever the issue is, let's use the film commission. People who are advocating for that are going to say it's going to, for every dollar you spend, you're going to get $10 back, right? And then other people are going to say you're going to spend dollars on that, but we actually have these other needs over here, and that you're going to. So some of it is harder to get at, but some of it, there is actually some data on other, especially if another state has implemented it and we can get a hold of their data. So it sort of depends on the topic and what other research has been done on it. And speaking into the small size of Vermont, sometimes our sample size is too small, so looking at other states is important. But sometimes we do actually have the information, and we do know, I don't know, there are this many children in this situation, and we actually have that information. So is it all perfect? No. And like everything, you're projecting into the future. And I think we do the best we can, just like you all do. Like we base it on the best information we have, and then often we get to evaluate it. The film commission might be harder, but other things like a tax expenditure, you can measure in the end and see how close you were on the estimates.
Somebody to tell me why we don't do sales taxes on locomotives. We'll put that off.
How about on sugar?
If I could, I think it's a really interesting, you brought up some interesting examples, because I think there are often places where your office will very clearly offer data about something that like there won't necessarily be an impact. So like many an issue brief on the military pensions, or I think with the RAND study, there was really a pointing to the fact that like there aren't, I think a lot of us, myself included, had an assumption that a huge number of women were going to enter the labor force if we significantly expanded access to childcare. And it's actually not like the RAND study said, like, there's like a huge number of really great things that will happen to your economy if you do this. It won't actually be that many more women entering the labor force. And I think so many of us just like read that and just ignored it and kept on trucking. And you all are in a really interesting position when we do that, because I think there's the problem that we don't read the reports. And then there's the problem that we read the reports and don't act on the reports, right?
Yeah.
And purposely sort of bury them or forget about them.
But I think there's another piece on top of that.
Yeah.
Is that now if you listen to what's going on here, the three of you have been here and you've seen this come and go year after year, you've put things in place and then you're looking back and did they work or not? And look, and we haven't been through enough, and you're sitting there, and I know you're doing the same thing, going back through what we've been on in committee the short time that we have, and said, wow, if I wasn't back next year, are they going to look at the 4 or 5 things that we talked about? And we pass, sports betting is coming. Who's tracking to make sure that any of those great things that were promised really did or did not happen? And what is, and we're going to hear about the maybe huge increase in addicts of whatever the gambling problem. But we also pass, several liquor changes on this individual serving and buying certain things in the store, package stores or whatever they call it. We don't know if the people on that committee change whatnot. It's not just that people do or don't read it. There's also the part of people leave. And it's back to what you were talking earlier. What structurally is in place that isn't your legislative individual interest or advocacy that goes back and makes sure that happen? And transportation is a massive chunk, but I look at a lot of the things that are, they ask to do a lot of different things, from, stormwater to wastewater runoff to the pollution in the lake to let alone actually paving, which we spend very little time talking about. If it weren't for the members in the committee that come back every year advocating for electric bikes or something, that wouldn't necessarily happen. And where's the structure that comes back and looks at all of those programs and we change. But I do see, and this has happened now in our third, we are looking at it very differently, or not differently, but really trying to understand
differently.
how can we be a better legislator on the next bill that comes through. I'm sitting here saying, I'd really like to see somebody write the intent of the transportation bill, because it did say, does it or does it not? Are we looking to improve traffic flow, or are we really looking to mitigate the impacts of climate things that happen in the flood? Are we really are we building any new roads? Are we not? Or where are we really trying to go? Is there an intent of the transportation bill other than the fact that we're going to spend $900 million? So there's a lot of these pieces that I just sit here and keep taking. But in addition to where you were at, it isn't just those things that do happen. I think that a massive, and we really saw it with this huge turnover recently. But if you don't send the same people back, or there's not a structure in the committee, there has to be a structure within the committee, within the resources, who manages the committees, that somehow the information that comes back on the bills that somebody determined were most important, they have to be set up in some way for review, because we all are coming and going. It's in that structure.
Exactly. That's why we're here. And that's why it's so good to have some that haven't been here a long time and some who have been here a long time, because together, hopefully we can come up with a good bunch of recommendations that get at exactly what you're saying. That's government accountability, right? Is being able to look back and see if what we intended is actually happening. And if not, why not?
And if we don't change the structure, there has to be something in there because everybody that's coming has got a new set of.
Yeah.
And even there are places we spend money or things we do in government that it's no one's baby project. Like really, like somehow we do it over and over again, but there isn't a single person in the building who particularly cares or is tracking it. And so like no one's without the structure, even if we had complete 100% returning members, still no one would be paying attention to that, because there's just like functions of government that just need to happen without a champion. So I think the structure is needed regardless. I love having you all here because I feel like you are showing up with this like really great hopes and dreams that I think in some ways like the three of us have like seen squashed. So my first year on government accountability, I said, the problem is that we're not training new members, as you said, Catherine. And GAC sponsored this like amazing all day long training, like 70 members came to it. And it was a really solid training, if I do say so myself. And like, it really made no difference at all.
You mean in the operations and health?
Yeah. Yeah, nothing. Yeah, and like every chair's asked for reinforcement of the training in their committees, and that happened, and still like everything just kept on going on the same way.
And that's why we're trying to find structurally, can we make some changes that will help us think before we do? And hopefully set up ways that we will look back before we move forward. And I think that's really why we're here. And this has been incredibly eye-opening because, in the end, everything comes down to money, no matter what, right? And I find one point you said at the beginning that's really sitting in my head right now is that we may have an idea of how we think a bill is going to play out when we write the bill. But if we don't spend the correct amount of money to make it happen, then it's not going to have the outcomes that we want it to have, right? In many ways, we are like a lab up at UVM in that we are coming up, when we pass a bill, we have a hypothesis, we have an idea of what we think is going to happen. Then we hear testimony, we look at old information in the committee room. And then again, we are putting forward our best guess at a hypothesis for a solution for something. But then we have to measure it and watch it, just like if we were in the lab and it needs to come out the other end. And then we can say we had the solution or we didn't have the solution. And we start over just like a scientist. In some ways.
I think those three questions, the how much do we do, how well do we do it, is anyone better off, often misses a key piece of how well did we do it, which is the how much do we do it is like both all of the staff stuff and the widgets and the amount of money was spent. And the how well did we do it should answer the question, did we fund it adequately? That's part of doing something well. And I think that gets left out when it's just program staff that are the ones delivering the message.
And what about, could someone else do it as well or better?
Mhm.
I mean, shouldn't we be asking that too?
Yeah.
But that goes
Cheaper.
to some of the things that we talk about in some of the notes that we've done so far about projected ways to go about it. And in a way, it's that issue, if you ask the people who wrote the bill and designed it, those of us who are still here, we are less likely to criticize ourselves for poor decision-making and lack of planning.
Yes.
That goes to the issue that in some cases, when you evaluate things, the independence of the evaluator is important. That's why auditors are independent.
Yeah.
Because they don't have a dog in the fight. Maybe the best way to evaluate our bills is to have legislators from New Mexico evaluate it, and then we can evaluate.
Oh, yeah, we could do a swap.
Yeah.
But, you know, it is the same issue that arises when we talk about agencies that are responsible for evaluating themselves and wonder why their evaluations aren't as critical as others might be. And that again, is something structural that we should be thinking about it. And we have a little bit in some of the recommendations or draft recommendations that
Right.
so far.
And for the agencies that have customers who aren't us, but they're members of the public, it would be great to get honest feedback, easy feedback from those customers.
You have to be careful about how the feedback is requested. I mean, you could use the Delta method. Have you ever called Delta Airlines at the end of a call? And they ask you for a one-question survey. And the one-question survey is how well did the last person you talked with deal with your problem on a scale of 1 to 5? Well, that isn't an evaluation because the other 4 people you talked about before you got to the last person were real disasters.
That's true. No, you're right. The questions, yeah. But we're not asking any questions now.
Is so absolutely critical. It's also how you measure. Let's say you're building a house, and I've seen this before. We see it some in government, building a house. Well, what are the measurements of how that house building worked? Well, the number of nails that you drove, the number of gallons of paint that you used, those aren't measures.
Right.
They aren't measures about because it doesn't tell you whether or not the kitchen is functional.
Right.
Right.
You know,
And for how long.
And so that again is critical about questions that you ask.
Yeah. Totally agree, but we're not even asking any of those questions,
No.
but yes.
Yeah. No, all good. Sorry,
No, I'm fascinated by this. This is great.
it's funny because in our first meeting, we had people come in and testify, and we didn't have many questions. Now we're really getting it. We've got some stuff on paper.
And now we're all going to retire at the end of
Yeah.
this session. There'll be no continuity.
That's right. Exactly, but we're getting there. Anyway.
I have one quick thing to comment on, which is just thinking about your training on like the training didn't work. There's an example of something that didn't work out the way. And so you have to you either evaluate it, you do it differently, or you stop doing it. But it's also hard for agencies with the public taxpayer dollars. I'm thinking about owning when things aren't going well. Like it doesn't, can also become a political public issue that it's a very hard thing. And so that makes the conversation, I think, harder. You like airlines, I was thinking about the airlines because you said that, how they have a thing where the pilot error, they have a whole system where they catch people, they acknowledge that there's a whole different way of dealing with it. And that system doesn't apply to much of the rest of the world. And I think public tax dollars need to be spent well. It should be spent well. And it's also hard when your program is not effective, how it comes out in public and how you deal with it.
Great, thanks. Yeah, that's a good movie.
And sometimes it's terrible stuff that you should deal with, but sometimes it's just like you tried this program and everybody bought into it and it just didn't take. It seemed like it was going to take, but it didn't take. So what do you do next?
You need a team to tell us. Thank you.
Yes, thank
A
you.
little bit off time, but I think it was worth it.
Thank you very much.
Good discussion, so thank you. And if you come up with some ideas.
I'm sure I'll have the answer.
Let us know. Okay, now we're moving on to Will and Mari, who are on virtual. And hello. Good to see you again, Will, and nice to meet you, Mari. We are going to be talking with NCSL about, and this is something we did before, but not everyone was here. So I just want to say once again, we are going to hear from NCSL on the number 2, 3, and 4 in our powers and duties. So these are all the equity questions, ways to ensure equity in pay across commissions, ways to ensure equitable participation, and codifying mechanisms for controlling and restraining how many commissions and committees and so forth we have. So these are ideas from all over the country, and we are very excited to have you both with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Brumstead and members of the committee. Happy to be back. Again, for the record, my name is Will Clark, and I'm a program principal with the National Conference of State Legislatures. I'm joined by my colleague, Mari Henderson, who is a senior policy specialist, and we both work in the Center for Legislative Strengthening. Let me start my presentation. Can you all see my presentation all right?
Yes.
Excellent. Great. Yeah, so today, how the presentation is going to work is I'm going to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes. I'm going to go through some examples from other states that are related to those 3 objectives that you just mentioned. And then at the end, Mari's going to round things out and provide some additional commentary, and then we'll be happy to answer any questions that you all have. So with that, we'll get into, we spoke with you all in September, me and my colleague, Carrington Skinner, and we were talking more about performance evaluation, program measures, and then looking at oversight tools. And that was to address goal number 1, looking at ways to ensure that the legislative branch is accountable to the people of Vermont. And I see you're continuing that conversation, which is really great. During that conversation with you all, I talked about various oversight tools, which included work of committees, studies and analyses, rules review, sunset and sunrise process, and evaluation and audit. And I just bring that up because I'll be turning back to some of these tools that are being used in other states, and talking about maybe how they can be used to address these other objectives that you have. And you just mentioned these 3 objectives. These are what we'll be talking about today. We do have some information on each of these objectives. However, I just wanted to qualify that for the objective number 3, providing appropriate compensation material support, we don't have comprehensive information on that particular component. We track legislator pay and legislative staff pay, but we don't track board and commission compensation. And so it's an issue that we internally didn't have a lot of information for you all on. And then looking nationally also, we didn't find a lot that was directly related. And I believe in part that's because their economic conditions in each state are very different, and then the needs and variability of committees. So with that said, we do have some information. And I wanted to start off by framing the conversation with just some kind of common element. So the idea of equity in pay. So this is an issue that has been around for quite a while now. At the federal level, there's the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which prohibits sex-based wage discrimination between men and women in the same establishment who perform jobs that require substantially equal skill, effort, and responsibility under similar working conditions. And then there are many other laws that address different components of equal pay at the federal level. And so all states are required to uphold those laws, but then at least 42 states have their own pay equity laws. And so I have some examples here for you all. California has the Equal Pay Act. There in Vermont, you have the Fair Employment Practices Act. And then Illinois has the Equal Wage Act. And so these vary a bit from state to state. But the point that I wanted to make here was that these laws, including the law in Vermont, they apply to private and public employers. And specifically in Vermont, they also apply to commissions and boards. So just setting the stage here, I know it's not exactly germane to your objectives, but I think it's an important component as we start talking about this issue. So today I'll be talking with regard to objectives 2 and 3, talking about board compensation. I'll be going over some reports from other states, talking about different ways that analysis can be conducted, and then going over some practices. Another important component I wanted to talk about, so I'm kind of framing this discussion in different steps that could maybe be taken that would eventually get to an analysis that might start addressing your objectives. And I think one important component that needs to be considered is the actual compensation for boards and commissions. So before you can really start talking about what should be, you have to have an idea of what is. I've got 3 examples here. on different compensation statutes. So oftentimes board and commission compensation is in statute that can vary widely within the state and depend on the board and the commission. But these two examples at the top, Maine and Michigan, those are statutes that are directly related to specific types of boards and commissions, whereas Washington is a more general reference about compensation more generally for boards and commissions. And I think it's more akin to what you have in Vermont in 32 VSA section 1010, looking at compensation for certain boards. I think another important component in this, so you have your compensation outlined, and then it's really important to have a catalog of the boards and commissions in your state. So this is an example from Illinois. They put this together in 2022. It's the Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability. And as you can see, this is just a sample from one of the pages of the report where they have the title of the board, the function of the board, and then the salary of the members. So just a way that you can start putting this information together. There's a link to this report. And then I saw in Vermont, the Secretary of State, it looks like, is responsible for maintaining a registry of state boards and commissions. They provide various information. So it could be that that's, again, another way to connect some of this information with functions you already have in place. So this kind of rolls up again. So we talked about, compensation and statute, and then cataloging, and then you get up to this higher level where various states have done more in-depth reports on their boards and commissions. So you have there at the top, Kentucky did a pretty comprehensive report in 2012, and the purpose of that report was really to do more of a cataloging, looking at what the state's inventory of boards and commissions were, and then they developed various findings and recommendations from that. They do touch on I don't believe they touch on compensation in that report, but the other two reports, which are more recent, that Nebraska and Oregon study from 2020, they do specifically address compensation on boards and commissions, not from an equity lens, but they do begin to talk about that. And so it could be that these serve as maybe a directional guidance for you as you're looking at possibilities. And I just wanted to use that as an opportunity as well to talk about the Vermont Sunset Advisory Commission. I believe it was repealed effective near the beginning of this year, but they had similar powers and duties. And we're looking at inventorying groups, and then they had a review schedule. It was on a biennium. You're probably all familiar with that, but just again, wanted to kind of connect things that other states are doing to things that Vermont currently does or has done in the past. And then this is I think the kind of the more final step that gets closer to your objective 2 and 3. This is the actual analysis component. So you have what is happening in the state with the boards and commissions, and then this is more of getting into what should happen, and that can be addressing competitive compensation, or that could be looking at equity, that could be looking at different measures. So this example doesn't apply to boards and commissions, but I think it's something that could be adapted. So hopefully it's a useful reference for you all, but it's from Colorado. The Division of Human Resources annually puts together a compensation analysis where they measure and compare the total compensation that's offered to each of the state's classified employees. They do that to ensure that, again, that the compensation is competitive with both the private sector and public sector. And then those findings are used to develop recommendations for adjustments to salary and other benefits. So again, I think hopefully this can serve as a kind of a jumping board or thought process for you all as you're looking at recommendations and potential solutions for your objectives. Another tool that some states use, and again, this is geared towards a different grouping of individuals. It's for elected officials, but they have compensation commissions in several states. So I've got some examples here. One's from Washington and one's from Missouri. And then I have an example from a municipality. And I wanted to focus on the Washington example. So they have the Citizens Commission on Salaries for Elected Officials. And the purpose of that was to create a commission to establish salaries that reflected the duties of those positions, and also to remove political considerations from the process. And how they've done that in the past, I think the process has changed, but up until 2013, they had a system that they used to evaluate positions. And that was to assure consistent and accurate appraisal of those positions. And they used 3 kind of characteristics in order to do that. They looked at the knowledge and skills required by each position, the mental demands, and then the accountability. And so they would take those measurements, provide those to the commission, and then the commission would then be responsible for making adjustments possibly to the salaries of elected officials. again, not a direct apples to apples for the work that you're doing, but maybe something that could be adapted. And then the Independent Commission on Compensation for Elected Officials in Mesa, Arizona, serves as another example at the local level, but they have that independent commission that looks at elected officials' compensation. One, to determine if it's reasonable. Two, to try to attract competent and effective people to serve in public office. But three, which I think is a bit more germane to your work, and that's to make public service possible for every eligible citizen, not just those whose financial status enables them to serve. That starts to get more at that, I think, objective number 3. But in general, I think these tools are getting more at objective number 2, which is looking at compensation, ensuring that there's equity, depending on the duties and the roles of those positions. The last resource that I have regarding objectives 2 and 3 is this report from Connecticut. So this was done in 2020, and it's a follow-up report to one that was done in 2002. But Connecticut has a law that requires individuals who are on boards and commissions when they're, or people who appoint to boards and commissions, when they are picking members to try to get the most competent individuals, but also to endeavor to ensure that the boards and commissions reflect the diversity of the state. So it's something that's actually in statute for them, and they're not alone. There are around at least 8 other states that have similar measures that require diversity in state boards and commissions. Some of those apply specifically to individual commissions and boards, and then others are more broad, like Connecticut. But this report here that I've linked to, you can go and see. It's an overall summary of kind of how well the state boards and commissions are doing in implementing that policy. And then there's also a summary of some of the other states that have those policies as well. And then moving on to objective 4, which is again codifying mechanisms for controlling and restraining the increasing number of commissions, boards, and joint legislative committees. I wanted to return to one of the concepts that I spoke to you all about in September. That's the concept of a sunrise review. And again, just as a refresher, with sunrise reviews, again, you're all probably familiar with this concept, but the 3 most common criteria that are used, it's meant to address an unregulated practice. And so you're looking at harm, competency, and protection. So again, does an unregulated practice harm the public? Is that harm due to incompetent practice? And is the public currently unprotected? So really looking at a gap in oversight. And the reason why I bring this up is that when you're looking at boards and commissions, oftentimes they're implemented in order to address a gap. And so one of the mechanisms that you might consider as you're considering recommendations for controlling and restraining increasing number of commissions and boards is to put in a process like a sunrise review, where you could assess the need and then also assess whether or not there are other boards and commissions that are currently could possibly conduct that oversight role. So that's more of a forward-looking component, but then there are other states who have looked at kind of backward-looking or looking at the present. So this is an example from Iowa. They had a boards and commissions review committee that was tasked with looking at all of their boards and commissions and then making recommendations about either repealing or combining different boards. So they recently released their recommendations. The governor in that state has not yet acted on those, but this is just another example of what can be done. So again, looking at the 2 components, committees and boards and commissions that haven't been created yet, and then looking at the existing ones in order to meet that objective number 4. And again, I wanted to tie this back a little bit to the Vermont Sunset Advisory Commission that was recently repealed, that had similar powers and duties, but was looking at that on a biennial basis. That's also something that other states have looked into as well. And then for my last slide, I wanted to talk about a couple of audits. So that was the tool that we discussed in September. And so these are 2 audits from Massachusetts. So there was one that is more recent, that's the one on the left. And then there was one from 2014, the one on the right. So the more recent audit, they weren't necessarily going and looking into boards and commissions as a general review. They were looking at vacancies specifically. And one of their recommendations I thought resonated well with this particular objective. And that was the recommendation that the governor implement a review process for any new board or commission created to ensure that it is not duplicative and does not have a mission similar to that of an existing board or commission. And also that the governor combined duplicate responsibilities to create a single border commission. So that gets back at some of the work that other states have been doing, recommendations that are very similar. And then with the previous report, which was from 2014, they had a recommendation that the executive and legislative branches undertake a concerted effort to identify commissions that should be dissolved or sunsetted. We talked about sunsetting process in September as well. But again, it's that idea of looking forwards at new, creating new barriers potentially, or new processes for establishing new boards and commissions, and then looking what you have right now to ensure that there's not overlap and duplication. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is with that 2014 report, they also had a recommendation about both branches making a greater effort to identify Massachusetts residents who are qualified and willing to serve on boards that are lacking members. So again, just to highlight that you all are not alone in looking at boards and commissions, looking at membership. This is an issue that people have been looking at for a while now. And so I hope these tools are helpful for you. Happy to talk more about them after my colleague Mari presents. So with that, I'll hand it over to Mari Henderson, who's going to be talking to you about joint committees.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure. We have just one quick question.
Certainly.
When you looked across how compensation was figured out for boards and commissions, you sort of referenced sort of like education level or qualifications or things like that. Our boards and commissions tend to be sort of, you're compensated for the day you show up at the meeting. And there seems to be no conversation around some boards and commissions. You're really only doing work when you show up at the meeting, and some boards and commissions, you're spending 15 hours a week doing prep work for said single day meeting. Is that something that you've seen other states accommodate in some way or account for?
During my research, I did not look at that particular component. So, but that's definitely something that I could try looking into for you, and then get back to you about. I was specifically trying to look for the compensation, but I'd be happy to talk to some of my colleagues as well. And
I think it's an aspect of the compensation that is sort of is where a lot of the ability to serve kicks in. I think a lot of people can afford sort of one day of not making enough money, but an entire week of not making enough money is a different thing. So thank you. I'd appreciate it if you could.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Will, and thank you all for having me here today. I'm here to talk about those three special little words at the end of point number 4, joint legislative committees. At NCSL, I cover legislative rules and procedure and a little bit how the legislatures operate both on the floor and in committee. So I'm going to give you a broad overview today on that question of how you can codify mechanisms for controlling and restraining joint legislative committees being established. As you all are very well aware, committees do the homework of the legislature. Joint committees allow both chambers to work together kind of on that homework, especially if it's an issue that covers both chambers. So in thinking about how you rein back the number of joint legislative committees, I think the most important thing to do is highlight how they're established. So there are several ways that joint committees are established in states. The two main ones being by legislative rule and legislative statutes. Those kind of split 50%. The states that do have joint committees, about 50% of them establish those joint committees specifically in standing rule, whether that be by chamber or with joint rules. And the other 50% establish those committees via statute. So you might see that especially in chamber or in legislatures like Colorado's General Assembly. Joint Budget Committee is one of the big joint committees in Colorado that's established in statute. Kind of the two outliers between those two on how joint committees are established are Washington, which their joint committees are established using concurrent resolutions, and Vermont, which you all have 3 different ways to establish a joint committee, which is by joint rule, by statute, or by joint resolution. So those are the outliers. I want to talk a little bit about caveats to this information, though. Specifically, Maine, Massachusetts, and Connecticut are 3 legislatures where all of their standing committees are joint. They don't have individual chamber standing committees. Those are all of their committees are done all of that committee work is done with a joint committee. So while all of those three chambers have their joint committees established in rule, it's also important to remember that that is how their committees operate. It's only as a joint committee. And the second one that I'd like to highlight that I think is kind of germane to this question that you all are offering is that there are some joint committees that are established that are inactive. So for example, every year NCSL collects what committees are active in states. So that's any committee that is in their standing rules or from their statutes. So when looking at those committees, it's very common for me to see the last action taken by that committee was 2009, but that's still technically considered an active committee. So just because the committee is listed as an active committee doesn't mean that they're actually actively taking care of legislation or going through those processes. My section is a lot smaller than Will's section because I only had a little bit to do. That's all I have prepared, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you. That is helpful and interesting how we have three ways that we can form yet more committees. But I appreciate that. I do have a question going back to the equitable participation. We have, because Vermont is small and we don't have a lot of diversity, one of the things that I think that I don't know if it's number 2 or number 3, ways to ensure equitable participation. One of the issues we have is that it's very hard to find people we have so many committees that you end up using the same people, especially from minority groups, that in order to be sure that we have equitable equitable participation, as in that on that committee. And then you want to create another committee and you want to use similar people, and it becomes overwhelming. And so the question we're really looking at here is there any way to address this? Less committees, for sure, or do you have committees that take on more issues rather than every time you have one issue, it creates a committee? Could you have, do any states have a committee that is not issue specific? Maybe it has 4 or 5 issues that they are working on, so that you're not asking so much from the same people. Anyhow, is that as confusing as it could be of a question?
I think I can try to address a couple of those points, just kind of going back to my presentation. And then if Mari has any kind of follow-up remarks, then I'll defer to her as well. I think in answer to your first question, I would say the report that I shared is one of the last resources from Connecticut, the Diversity on State Boards and Commissions. They specifically kind of highlight that issue, and that the committees, there's not a strict requirement that the committees reflect the gender and racial diversity of the state. There's a requirement that they make a good faith effort to ensure that. So I think that's just a general consideration across, probably in any jurisdiction where there's going to be a board or commission. You're going to have challenges possibly in finding individuals, even like, as you mentioned, even just sometimes filling commissions like Mari mentioned, and having commissions meet. So that's kind of, I think, my answer to number 1. And then your answer kind of addressing number 2, the combining of committees. Again, I think that's something that a lot of states are looking at. So if you look at that, the Iowa committee that was responsible for looking at the different commissions to look at combining them for their missions, and also that audit from Massachusetts, I think that's getting at that issue, as well as, with Massachusetts, there was concern about vacancies in committees. And so, that's part of where that recommendation for possibly combining came from. And then with Iowa's, I'm not entirely sure what the impetus was for that particular review, but I think it served a similar purpose. So that's kind of my thought on your question. And Mari, open it up to you.
Yeah, I'll jump in a little bit to speak a little bit on committees broadly. Your question about kind of breadth of, I think it kind of comes down to breadth of committees. So for example, there are some chambers that have a ton of committees, and each committee is very specific. You know, they might have a committee on local legislation for each of the counties. That's something that happens in some legislatures. They might have, I'm looking at my list right now, the Judiciary Committee split up by civil or criminal, so they can get very specific. But also in a lot of legislatures, those committees are more broad. It might just be public safety. It might just be veterans. And so I think the breadth of the committee can speak to how much work that committee is doing to limit the number of small specific committees. And that allows subcommittees to do a little bit more work. I also want to highlight interim committees. So a lot of chambers will establish interim committees to look at very specific issues that they're having. So for example, Colorado has an interim committee on, I believe, I can't remember the exact name right now, so don't quote me on this, but Colorado has an interim committee on rising utility costs. And so that's a really important committee for them, but it has a sunset date because it's only for the interim. So that's something that a lot of chambers also use as a mechanism to kind of get at those more specific examples that maybe doesn't require a full committee meeting or a full committee for the whole session or a standing committee for it, but still allows them to do that research and the work during the interim to maybe bring to one of the standing committees to kind of work on that during session.
Any other questions? Okay.
I should share, and this is more just for people's awareness in the room. So I found out that I was on a joint committee when it actually, like, a meeting was called of it on it. And like the committee had not met for like 5 years, but it is actually a useful committee to be there when it's needed. So before this happened to me, I would have been like, yeah, if a committee doesn't meet for 2 years, it should probably just disappear. Like, what are we doing here? So it's just sort of like an interesting piece of context
Yeah.
about all the silliness.
Well, this has been helpful. Thank you. We may have, I'm sure you'll hear from our government operations committees down the road. We can only do a small snippet of what needs to be done on 2, 3, and 4. But this is helpful in your report. We'll definitely pass along to those committees. So thank you.
And thank you for your time. And then we'll follow up with that other question and then get back with you with any information that we find.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Okay. So now, just so you know, for those, we've had different people come in at different times, so I'm going to say it one more time.
Thank you.
Sorry. But at 3:00, Susanna Davis is going to come and talk about what we just heard about the equity questions from 2-3. What we're going to do now, and I wonder if we should take a 5-minute break just to sort of refresh and begin again. But what we're going to do is go over these recommendations that have to do with the first part. Okay. And just see where we're at. And I just want all of you to know where they come from. They come from you all. I went back and listened to our meetings and talked with various folks individually and then know my own feelings. I also pulled from the auditors' suggestions, and I pulled from Building Bright Futures suggestions. And so that's where they all came from. The piece that you got at 5:00 last night, I'm very sorry. I had no idea it would take so long. It was essentially a week-long project. But then what happened is Tim, this morning from Legislative Council, was fantastic. He took it all and put it and made it all look nice and put it in some kind of order. And so that's what we have before us, but it's not hugely different. Senator Brock and I did then go over and condense a couple. So there's just, that's all that's been done. And what I'm thinking is we could take a break, come back, and maybe just read through them and first see what you think of each one. If there are specific, remember that sometimes you might think, oh, it's missing this, but then number 9 might have it. So we'll just sort of fumble our way through until 3:00. Tim is going to help us by coming up and taking what we say and so forth, so that can embed all of that good information into our recommendations so we can keep moving forward. And then at 3:00, we'll hear from Susanna, and then we might have a little bit of time after, at the end of that, to think about how we want the fourth meeting to go. I do know that Susanna would like to present. She's mostly going to set the stage today for 2, 3, and 4, but she'd like the opportunity in our fourth meeting to really bring others and talk about it a bit more, which I understand and so forth. So we may end up needing a fifth meeting, or maybe our fourth meeting could be a little bit longer. We could meet in the morning and then have like lunch and then come back and do our work of
I love that idea.
you know, what Tim brings us, yeah, so that we wouldn't have to have another meeting. And so there'll be a new doodle poll for that, just in case we start to run out of time and people have to take off. I want to say that there's an old doodle poll that's, I think, only
One person.
one person responded to. So forget about that one. Don't go looking for it. It's like October 8th. We're gonna get a new one and it will help us. And I'm thinking a week and a half or so after Thanksgiving, it would start and then give us some dates. Is that good? For now?
Yeah.
Okay, so 5, yeah, it's almost 10 after, so quarter after, so that gives us 7 minutes. How's that? We'll start at quarter after. We'll give us 45 minutes to go through these and then go on. Thank you.
Thank
We're back on. Hi, welcome. We're back to talk about our recommendations and move to the next part of today's meeting. Before we started that, I just wanted to say one thing that really struck me that I thought would be helpful in all of us thinking about why we're doing this, why we're here, is that I've been attending, as you know, I worked hard on the childcare bill this year. And so I've been attending these little sort of events they've been having all over the state where Let's Grow Kids is running it. And, you know, they have speakers from different places that come and they give you a tour of a new site and what they're able to accomplish with the new funds and the new information. All fine. But one thing that just struck me was the other day, a couple of days ago, I went to one and they had the president of the Vermont Business Roundtable speak. And he gave a whole speech, but at the end of his speech, he said, as a Vermonter, I want to make sure we have a childcare system that is effective, data-driven, and accountable to the results that it produces. And I just thought, that's it. That's why we're here in this room, is that there are a lot of Vermonters out there that want that. They want to feel as if their government is accountable. So anyhow, I saved it just for today. I asked him to send me his little, so. Okay, let's see. How do you want to do this? We could go through each one. Maybe Tim could help us by running through them, and then let's at the end of each one talk about it and see if you think it's a good, you know, if we should move forward with it, or, you know, whatever we think. We can just,
Could we take it like 3 minutes to read silently first?
Sure.
Is that okay? I just this first.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I love it.
Sorry, I didn't do it during the break.
That was yeah, no, that's good. The beginning, just so you all know, where it says government accountability means that is just off the internet. That is no, I just thought it made sense when we send these over that we have to have some maybe definition. And so we can all talk about it. It's not like set in stone. Okay. Do you need more time? How much?
A little bit more time, I think.
Okay.
Even though I've read this twice, I need more time.
We have 25 minutes left, so I'm getting a little.
Always helps to review things before you start discussing.
Absolutely.
Not essential, but it's helpful.
People have been watching us read. How fun.
I can tell you it's scintillating.
Josie, you shouldn't be watching us. You should be reading.
I've been reading.
I'm teasing.
Okay, so what did it say?
It said a lot of actually really good things. I thought, and some of it seems so obvious, and maybe it's because I'm a newbie, but I'm like, well, yeah, committee assistants should be able to keep track of deadlines, and I don't know if there needs to be a system in place, but I was struck when we got all those reports about what reports are due. It is not impossible, but it is a very time-consuming process to figure out, has the report been turned in? Where has it been turned in? Have all the right people seen it? And I think this goes to what Emily was saying earlier about turnover, and just, we have new chairs, we have people who don't, and I'm on the select board here in Grand Isle, and all we're talking about is standard operating procedures. And it feels like at the end of every session, even though people are probably, I haven't had at the end of a session, the end of a biennium yet, there should be some sort of notebook, or like just simply says, from your committee, these are the bills that we passed. Have them all in one place. And then if someone can pull out, like, these are the things, the timelines we have to hit. These are the deadlines we have to hit. That doesn't seem like rocket science to me.
I agree. I like the standard operating procedures. I like that.
I have to say, it's made managing Grand Isle town politics and policies so much easier, because we can just say, you know what? We know we have, and the reason we started it is because we blew a deadline for our emergency management plan, and now we don't have one, which puts us in a real liability should we have a disaster here, because then we're on the hook for FEMA funds.
Right. Yeah.
Postmortem that you're asking for, is that what you're saying?
Do you want us to go in order by the items?
That's what I was
Okay.
thinking. We'll just, and sort of walk us through each one and.
That work for you too?
I'd be happy to. In the interest of time, would you like me to just kind of read into the record the summary of recommendations rather than go into the detail under each one, since
Yeah, what does everyone think?
That's fine.
I think that's a good idea.
Talk about it.
Yeah, we want to talk about it in detail, but.
I'm just wondering, and this may be just the way this is constructed, we should be looking at a document that consists of 5 pages, correct?
Right, you got extra. They're just.
I got, many extra pages, including
Yeah.
some back to back, but I assume that's just a type of record.
Yeah, I think so. It was the way that it came through. I pulled mine off, so I'm guessing.
Okay.
But going one by one.
Yeah, we'll go one by one. Okay, so let's start.
For the record, my name is Tim Devlin, Legislative Counsel. Thank you very much for having me today. The first item on the draft proposal recommendations for the summer government accountability commissions. We have, again, a 5-page, which should be a 5-page document. It's more, there's a printing error. I apologize for any confusion generated by that. First recommendation is general oversight function is needed. And this one I'll just spend a little bit more time on, just because it's a little bit more detailed than some of the others. In particular, I'll just kind of cut to the meat of this, if that's okay. This proposes creating a government oversight and accountability committee. The committee would do the following. A, examine in relation to accountability in conjunction with the committees of jurisdiction matters of significant public concern that affect the state as a whole. B, the committee would also selectively review the findings and recommendations of audits conducted by the state auditor and federal agencies, and also examine whether these findings have been implemented. C, the committee would also conduct oversight themselves or refer matters to the committees of jurisdiction or empowering an independent third-party entity to do so.
We're going to discuss these.
Yep, so now we can just, let's discuss.
What I would look at, just the first thing, in terms of the recommendation, general oversight function is needed. Change it to read a general legislative oversight function. Which basically what we're talking about.
What are you?
Right here as number one,
Oh,
the heading
okay.
number one, where both on the summary recommendations and also recommendations. There's a general oversight function needed, a general legislative oversight function
Yeah.
is needed.
I like that.
Then,
Wait, can I ask you a clarifying question about your suggestion? Do you mean that we would only oversee the work of the legislature, or the legislature would do the
the
overseeing?
legislature would do the oversight. That's
Okay.
Is what I mean by that.
Okay.
I don't know if I can clarify it any better in terms of.
Okay. Does that read like that to you?
I can words.
Okay, okay, thanks.
Yeah. Then, on item C, where it says conduct oversight themselves, refer matters to, would it be useful to head that by saying, depending upon the nature of the issue, comma, conduct oversight themselves, refer matters to the committees and so on and so forth? Would that clarification be useful?
Yeah,
Yes.
sounds good.
My big question on this, sorry, I didn't have you.
Yep. No, go.
My big question on this, I think this is great. I agree. How this committee makes decisions about what it picks up. I think it's going to be an important mechanical aspect of this whole thing to be figured out. I don't know if we have to figure it out ourselves. I think it's worth like naming that it's a thing that needs to be figured out in advance and not just by the committee itself. Because I think how that's selected will actually even inform who wants to serving on the committee, and the relative power of that committee with regards to other things. So I just would love to sort of name that as a dynamic.
I think that's a great point. It's an
Yeah.
excellent point.
One of the things you have to be careful about is there's always a tendency to have legislative leadership to make the determination. And that immediately raises a question about independence and political influence
Yeah.
in making decisions regarding oversight, which is always a danger.
And I think, I like though what Emily is saying is let's name that this is an issue because it's up to the government
Yeah,
operations committees to work out how you get there.
totally.
So,
And by naming sort of the examples of themselves already sets a tone as to what will or won't be addressed. I'm not sure that you need examples to help people understand what you're trying to do, but at the same time, it now becomes a timed document that's not nearly as relevant 6 months from now or a year from now.
EB5 is like pretty timeless, that one. And I would say juvenile justice will be timeless very soon.
I'm just thinking it has a dual role. It helps you say what word, but it becomes
we'll make sure.
outdated and already putting people to think, oh, is that what we're going to work on? So it,
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Right, but
you mentioned the power structures, you mentioned the politics impact of it. By listing examples, we're already influencing the idea of what should or shouldn't go into the committee. I guess is what I'm getting at. I don't, maybe we want to do that. I'm just saying it already does that.
I wonder if an opportunity to say something like, in the case of categorical government failures such as Woodside and EB5, which I feel like are sort of like objectively, someone messed up hard somewhere.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not.
I'm saying as such as might help with that.
It's hard to make it not
Yeah,
time specific.
yes,
Yeah, and it makes it much more in a bigger, that we're trying to get at a bigger picture of accountability from the literally three branches of government concept, and looking back at what we've done. So that's what I'm just trying to get at is that I'm naming specific items, unless they are completely historical, already gives that political flavor that you're talking about. So.
no, I think it makes sense to name things now, but not expect these names to be in the eventual legislation establishing it. But I think it's helpful to the conversation to have some examples now.
And
Like those are in the introduction as opposed to a specific piece.
Well, this isn't the actual legislation. This is our recommendation.
Yeah.
So I think it's okay to have it in our recommendation if we all agree that those things came to the level of being failures, basically, is what you're saying. Yeah.
And we'll have the date, it'll be dated, so it goes to the committees and then they're gonna move beyond that and this will become just part of the file, I think.
Just a minor thing, and this is probably more stylistic than anything, under C where it says conduct oversight themselves, but suggest conduct oversight itself. If you're referring to the committee.
Okay.
And we don't need to say the number of people or.
No.
That's from both.
Let them do all that, yeah. This is just, we think it's a good idea.
I would add something about answering a key question. So I think it would be really easy to sort of call in everyone related to EB5, have a lot of conversations about EB5 and never ask the question, how do we structure government to prevent this from happening again? Which in the case of sort of looking backwards is an important one, but maybe it's just saying something about like a structured process or something like that.
That's why it does say, see if, line 2 and 3, it says, accountable committee of the legislature that both dives into systemic issues and then remains responsible for seeing them addressed.
Thank you. That is covered.
Okay, okay. Okay, the only other thing I just received a letter from the chief performance officer who wonders if this committee would have some relationship to the chief performance officer, the way that it did when we were the Government Accountability Committee. And I don't
See the link anymore. I see the link between the chief performance officer and to a few of the other recommendations. I could see a really strong place for the chief performance officer. I don't in the case of this particular committee.
Not so much. Okay, I promised I would bring this up. Okay, so.
Yeah, I think the notion of them talking with each other, but to have a structural relationship, I'm not sure that's there.
And it would just be only legislators who would be on the committee.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to 2.
Yeah, I just think of what we're talking about principles. If one of the objectives, principles, or one of the things we're talking about is the independence of view as to performance. Doing a lot of evaluation of our own performance here.
Yeah.
The lack of objectivity is implicit in this document.
Okay.
The second recommendation states, adding a program evaluation staff function to assist the Vermont legislative branch with improved accountability. Then I would direct your attention to the second half there where quoting, it would seem Vermont has 4 alternatives. 1, could build our own audit function. 2, add resources to the state auditor's office. 3, bolster a JFO program evaluation function. 4, nothing.
It's actually that sentence I have questions about.
Which one?
That it would seem Vermont has 4 alternatives.
Yeah, yeah.
Because the build our own audit function and JFO program evaluation function don't strike me as mutually exclusive. I'm not sure what the difference between those 2 things is. And maybe I'm happy to have someone tell me. I could totally be wrong. And then I also don't see this. I think the way the sentence reads, it doesn't give us space to be doing, say, all 4 of those things or 3 of those things. And I think it might actually benefit us to do
3 of them.
3 of them.
Yeah, yeah. I see what
Or
you're saying.
should we at this point make a recommendation?
Yeah.
I mean, I know I have a view.
I feel ready to make a recommendation.
Which we could do. We could definitely do that.
I was hoping we'd have the same one.
I hope so too.
Oh, I don't want to be sure.
So, shall I go? Okay. I would like to bolster a JFO program evaluation function, which I see as maybe the same thing as building our own audit function.
That's genius.
And I do think that there might be space in the future for building out resources for the auditor's office, but I'd like to do that actually in the case of specific bills. And that if we add an audit function to a specific bill, we just know that we can't do that without,
Resourcing it.
resourcing it. Yeah.
I agree with you. And the notion of JFO having that responsibility, it has a degree of independence on the one hand. It doesn't involve creating a new organization, which is is something that we discourage. On the other, it doesn't focus on the auditor's office because there are issues as to whether the auditor's office wants the evaluation the way that the legislatures who are charged with this want to do the evaluation. So all in all, the JFO to me is the right answer.
And adequately resource it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, so that we have
We have
permanent,
to say that.
So we have time to see.
yeah.
And they're not being dragged off to do something that somebody else wants them to do rather than the legislature.
Right, right.
Yeah, so adequately
Sounds good.
resource. What was the second part of that? And adequately resource and
Established with a degree of continuity. I think what we're
Yeah.
saying.
okay, so for Tim's purposes, yeah, and accountable to the legislature.
Right, which they already are, and I-
It's not accountable to the legislature.
And can we spell out acronyms the first time we use them?
Mhm.
And then just, this is a picky thing, but instead of saying adding, can we say add and then make sure or ensure and then change the timing? Just have action statements and be consistent. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we probably don't need then, it would seem Vermont is for alternatives. Let's just do this. Let's just make our,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And then we can say, for example, Maine presents, because interestingly, what we're saying in these first two ones is we're going to do what Maine does, which is we're going to have a staff function along with a legislative committee directed to, or dedicated to directing and reviewing its performance audits. So it's almost the same. They're not doing the audits,
The
but
performance audits are not necessarily the same thing, just in terms of terminology. Performance audits are a function that, under government auditing standards, the auditor performs. But performance could be viewed very differently than what we're talking about here in terms of specific programs and specific legislation in terms of performance. So these are not necessarily just performance audits
okay, so
that we're talking.
So should we put in the, for example? I like the examples to help the committee know where to look when they want more information. So we'll leave that in.
Well, and we can have a list of resources too.
Yeah, I don't know if Maine, for example, refers to these as, as reviewing performance audits or uses other language.
Yeah, I'm not sure that is
We could just get
a
into
point that
a
the
language
auditor
issue
made.
here of performance audit, which has a very specific meaning. And I think we're talking broader than that. We're talking about performance of government functions, performance of programs
And
that can be
financial.
measured by performance audit, but it can be measured in other ways, such as continuing standards against which success is measured. And that's different than a performance audit.
And
Probably
would-
included in it, but different.
yeah, okay. And wouldn't financial audits be included in this if we wanted them to?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so okay.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking,
Yeah, so we're not limiting the scope of audits.
yeah, what we're saying here in 3 is making sure the state and federal audit findings are considered. And, typically the findings are, what you're really talking about here are conclusions of audit deficiencies, significant deficiencies and material weaknesses, those kinds of things you're talking about. But you don't want to get into all the technical junk.
Okay. Okay, let's move. I'm just getting worried because of the time. So let's move to 3.
And that is the third recommendation of the committee draft form is making sure both state and federal audit findings are considered. I can read out more if you'd like, but that's.
But it's essentially fits with 1, right? Kind of.
I have a few quick thoughts.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. And when you're ready to tell me to be quiet, I will really respect you to be quiet. I think if we say this, we need to say like structurally ensure that it happens. And that like the structure needs to be found, and maybe that's giving that, maybe it's including 3 in 1. And you were just saying they were linked, Representative Brumsted, but I think it just as a standalone, it doesn't have enough teeth. And I'm grateful that the auditor's office at least advocates for their own audits. We have absolutely no system whatsoever for paying attention to federal audits, and we fail federal audits all the time. And I only hear about them through rumor.
Me too. I know exactly what you, another word.
I don't know where to find them.
Yeah, that's the thing. There's like
There's
no,
no,
and so I think that being like the tracking function around that would be a really important piece of this.
That's a great idea. So have it be like C or something and
I was thinking it was
Box
actually
D down
combined
to
in
D.
one.
Bear in mind, by way of background.
Yeah.
There can be audits and recommendations that an auditor
Oh, yeah.
provides
Yeah.
that an agency disagrees with, and we may look at it and disagree with it too.
And that's fine, but at least you look
The fact
at
that,
it.
yeah, exactly, that's it.
Yeah.
and we get it to the committees of jurisdiction to, because otherwise, they're the ones paying the price, it seems. A lot of IT issues in Vermont that the committees don't realize that they're in danger of paying a penalty. And then we are paying a penalty. It comes out of our funds that we want to use to fund other things.
Can I ask who would be tasked with gathering those federal audits?
I would like it to be a staff function within the accountability office that would then give that information to both the committee of jurisdiction and the government oversight committee.
Okay,
Presumably, the state auditor's office is collecting, and this is one of the things to confirm,
Oh.
is collecting audits that are produced by federal agencies. So that may already be a single repository for that. How effective their collection process.
Did you collect that when you were auditor?
Yes.
Oh, really?
A long time-
Okay.
Again, that's a long time ago, and things change.
Well, and I think they get sent to the auditor
Yep.
too, because there's certain addresses that they get sent to.
But again, it may not be consistent, so I would check with the auditor's office and get their.
Yeah.
Well, that could be a job of the government operations committees, but should we put it then in as D on one? Okay.
That's what.
Yeah, I would actually honestly do it as C because the conduct oversight themselves is a whole different kind of category. I would just say C, review all state and federal audit findings, something simple.
And 1B reads very similar to that already.
Collectively review.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, there it is.
You kind of actually have that,
Thanks for reading.
but you have selectively.
Maybe bold it.
Okay.
Yeah, I know,
Okay.
that's good. Okay, so
That's funny.
Oh. Yeah, we could take out 3 then. So if there's anything in 3 that you want to keep, we can put it in B.
Okay.
I think examples here, I mean, to your point, they're gonna get old, but examples of where we failed would get folks' attention, but that might be in some sort of cover letter.
Yeah, we could put in parentheses and B, maybe in italics, the auditor frequently requests the opportunity to present its work before committees of jurisdiction.
And we know that
Those committees do seem to find the information educational and helpful. I don't know, something so that the government operations committees get that this is like a no-brainer. We should be doing this.
I would also add an example, just a sentence
Yeah,
around
an
like,
example.
and we know that there are areas that we regularly fail federal audit and.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, and are subject to penalties and fines.
Okay,
I can move that into a footnote.
okay,
Okay,
perfect, perfect.
We don't need to micromanage your drafting.
Okay.
Bringing us back on that one.
Okay, so number 4, which will now be number 3. If we keep it.
Should use the old numbers for now.
Yeah.
And let's see, this is the whole 4th recommendation is changing the timing of programmatic and performance measure budget reports.
This is all good. I like, it, but I wanted to add, change the timing of the legislative summaries so that they happen sooner after the session ends. Like, I don't know what's a reasonable amount, 30 days, 60 days, but I think 3 months is a long time to wait to know what you did.
Only if it was resourced properly, because I don't think there's.
Like the
they take it
resource properly,
yeah, I would just
because
say
it just shouldn't be that
Yeah.
way.
So do you mean the summaries that are listed on the after? So in some cases, it's because the governor doesn't sign it until he gets to the end of his time. So they haven't actually prepared the summary yet.
Right. Well, I thought the 30 days or whatever it is would be after it's
After it becomes-
enacted.
I don't know.
And maybe 3 days is too short. but-
Yeah, we can try. you know,
Just because then you can catch errors sooner.
sooner. Okay.
I would, so I think this is great around the dates of the programmatic and performance measure budget report. I would also love if we sort of change the default date of legislative reports generally from January 15th to December 15th. So that, because when things are delivered, once the session has started, they do not inform policy anymore. It's too late.
Yes, I agree.
And so I think just like a general recommendation for legislative council even to try to default to December 15th, rather than defaulting to January 15th.
I was wondering why we do that.
It's in statute.
Oh,
Well, if not specified in bill becoming legislation, then it's understood that the default is January 15th. And I think maybe there's kind of cultural norm that's built around that.
I have a drafting request for you.
Well, we can ask.
The default ones that didn't specify.
I know.
So
Even that, I would
Yeah.
I actually changed something in my life too.
Okay. Well, we can also ask government operations. They'll find out that way. If we leave this in here, they'll find out that it's in statute and it's a default. They could amend the
Well,
statute.
yeah, I think you gotta be specific,
So put the
as a specific,
Legislation.
for a specific recommendation that the default date be changed to December 15th.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought
They
that
can't
too.
say they missed it.
that too.
Yeah, I thought that, but I was just saying
Yeah.
that that's going to be part of the discovery too. Okay, next one. We have 1 minute. What are we going to do? Well, maybe we should talk about that for a minute. We have to get through these so that at our next meeting, we have something to react to, and it's 3:00. So we could hear from Susanna now and then see if we have a little bit of time left over to keep working through these.
Yeah, I can't run late today.
Okay,
Yeah, I've got hard stuff with
Yeah.
you.
well, okay, so
Could we have a quick Zoom meeting to go over these so people don't have to haul them on Pelier and we could hash it out in like an hour and a half, maybe?
It would count as one of our meetings.
Or
Oh,
we
would
could,
it? Would, oh,
we
then
could
we-
not be paid.
Yeah, that, if we're on Zoom, we don't have to put in for per diem, would that still count?
It still counts as a meeting.
But we can choose not to be paid.
It still
If you
counts as a
want.
meeting.
Yeah,
Right,
but-
Staff would still.
So what if we just had a longer fourth meeting then?
yeah, but then we don't give Tim time to clean this up.
Right, got it.
Should take her about 10 minutes.
Oh, great, okay.
okay.
So Susanna just said that it would take her about 10 minutes, so let's do that and then immediately jump on this. How's that?
Okay.
Thank you for listening and for being so helpful, Susanna. And I thought really quick, we might want to introduce, do you know everyone that's in the room? Would you like us to introduce ourselves real quick?
I'm pleased to say that I think I actually do know everyone in the room, but quick round of intros would be helpful because you're all very tiny on my screen.
Yeah. Okay. So you know me, Jessica Brumstead.
You know me.
Emily Kornheiser. Hi, good to see you.
Wendy Harrison, Wyndham Heights.
Josie on the screen.
Rondell Chittenden.
Matt Walker from Swanton and Sheldon.
Irene Renner from Chittenden North plus Fairfax.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for being here. And I don't know if you got to hear a little bit of the presentation from NCSL. Unfortunately, it didn't totally hit the mark that we were talking about earlier. So I don't want to interrupt you. Let's just go with what you'd like to do and also how much time you would need in the fourth meeting, like what you think is the right amount of time, so we can make sure that we have time, the right amount of time.
Okay, so I can actually be really quick today because I am hoping that we will have more opportunities later on to talk, and then I can tell you at length what I think the committee should be considering. And I was able to watch the live stream of this meeting from about 12:30 to 2. Then I had to dip out for an AI council meeting. So I saw the very beginning of Will's presentation from the conference. And then probably after I jump off now, I'll go back and watch the rest. So I just wanted to pop in and say hello to the Summer Government Accountability Commission committee because the previous iteration, the previous lifetime of the Government Accountability Committee, I had the pleasure of interacting with a little bit. This was circa 2021 when it was re-examining the Act 186 population level outcomes. I know that this is a little bit of a different roster, so it's nice to be able to work with a different set of you all. But I do have to admit that the last week or so has been a bit of a GAC whirlwind for me. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that with you all today. Everything that I'm going to mention today, I've also put it into a formal written document for you that I'll submit to the committee assistant. I apologize for not having it in early enough that you could have reviewed it before today's meeting, but nothing in there will be new based on what I'm saying now. So I just wanted to let you all know a little bit about how I found out that this was happening. It was about a week ago, I think, that a former colleague mentioned to me that the GAC, as we lovingly call it, had started meeting. And I put it on my to-do list to connect with you all to get started. And so I was a little bit surprised yesterday when I learned that the GAC had already reached its dissolution date by statute. So it was an odd week that came and went for me in terms of the work of this committee and led me down the Act 53 rabbit hole between yesterday afternoon and today. And I wanted to just highlight a couple of concerns with that I had. I know that not everybody in this room may have had a direct hand in creating the legislation, and that it may not have been designed in a way that the members of this committee would have preferred. So my comments really are just a reflection of how this was shaped. We're really concerned about the process equity factor here. Our office tries to stay updated on as many bills as we can because, of course, inequity shows itself in so many aspects of life. We don't just have one or two committees of jurisdiction. We watch all the committees because we have to. And even despite that sort of broad reach and trying to have eyes everywhere, this was something that slipped right past us, even though we had previous touch points with the Government Accountability Committee. And what that tells me really is that if we didn't even know about it, it's likely that a lot of really interested stakeholders didn't know and don't know about it as well. And I worry about the missed opportunity that presents. So sitting on, 30 plus state created boards and commissions, we definitely have seen the gamut in terms of short runways, short timelines, limited per diem structures. So I'm very familiar with the limitations and the challenges that it poses. And I think that in this case, this is a really extreme example of how that shapes up, recognizing that this committee has been given 4 months and about 4 meetings, at least 4 compensated meetings, to be able to do this really important work. It means that we're either selling the work short by not formally dedicating the time it needs, or selling you all short as members. Because if you choose to continue beyond your compensated meeting dates or the number of compensated meetings, then at that point you'll be doing unpaid labor, which is something we always try to discourage as a matter of process equity. So for those reasons, we're really concerned that the way in which the enabling legislation was structured is not fair to the topics it wants to address and is not fair to the members of the summer committee. Now, you all have 4 aspects to your charge. I know that you reviewed them at the top of the meeting and that you've had them very present in your minds throughout your work. It'll probably come as no surprise to you that the charges 2 and 3 and 4 are of particular interest to our office. Those are the ones that pertain most to equity and participation. We had a relatively lengthy excerpt from my annual report this past January that talked a little bit about these issues, and I'm happy to reshare that with the committee as well in case it could be useful to you. So in terms of charge 2, ensuring equity in pay across boards and commissions, one of the things I wanted to point out to you is that this conversation is happening in a few other spaces, and it may be useful for this committee to hear from those entities. In particular, I'm aware that the Environmental Justice Advisory Council has been having internal conversations about per diem rate and the opportunities and challenges that they pose to getting that inclusive participation. And the second group I'm aware of that's having the conversation is the Land Access Opportunity Board. So I think those are two state-created working groups that have been really very thoughtfully created. And this committee would benefit from hearing from them about ways in which the per diem structure could be evaluated. Beyond engaging with them, beyond engaging with our office, I do think that despite the short timing and the limitations of this enabling legislation, that it is still very much worthwhile for this committee to make every attempt that it can to engage with the public in a way that's meaningful. I am aware that sometimes we have peers across government who will go through the motions of doing a listening session or a survey because they want to appear to have checked the box. And that's not the kind of engagement that's really going to help move the needle. So we would recommend that this committee consider a well thought out process that it could take between now and the January report, so that you can not only solicit that public feedback, but more importantly, incorporate it into the committee's January report. Of course, we have suggestions on how that can be done effectively. And given some of our recent examples that we've had in some of our working groups, we also have a lot of examples of what not to do to put forward a good community engagement effort. The last thing that I am going to say is I know that you all probably have a lot of materials that you're combing through, but I'm willing to guess that a lot of them have come from legislators or those affiliated with legislators or from government actors. And if you haven't already, it's going to be really important that as you formulate recommendations on community participation, that you consult sources that are community driven and that are community centered. And so we have a substantial bibliography that I'm looking at right now that our office put together on relevant sources for you all. But there are two that I want to highlight on the front end that are accessible and that are a good starting place for you. Again, I'll submit this in writing. The first one is a document that our office routinely comes back to and routinely recommends to others. It's called A Toolkit for Centering Racial Equity Throughout Data Integration, Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy. It came out of University of Pennsylvania. The Racial Disparities in the Criminal and Juvenile Justice Systems Advisory Panel has also relied heavily on it in the formation of its report last year. And this is a very valuable resource that I think would be of good use to this committee, particularly because it discusses the intersection of community access with data. And I know that this committee is particularly focused on metrics and accountability and quantifiable ways to evaluate government. The second resource is called The Spectrum of Community Engagement to Ownership. And it talks a lot about the spectrum of how community members are empowered or disempowered in processes. So it refers to a spectrum of engagement to ownership, which, if any of you is familiar with the ladder of participation or the ladder of citizen participation, as it's often called, it's very similar. We kind of have the one end of the spectrum where we hold community members very much at arm's length, where we're ignoring them. There's the next stage where we're informing them, so basically making decisions on their behalf and around them, but just letting them know on the back end what we've done. Next stage up would be consulting them. The next stage up would be involving. The next one would be collaborating. And then the last one, on the other end of the spectrum, would be deferring to, which is where you see communities most empowered and having the greatest degree of agency in decision-making that affects them. So the second resource that I'm sharing with this committee discusses that at length and also has a couple of visual aids to help you understand that. So again, I will end it here. I know you all are short on time and I just have far too much to say for it to fit into your remaining time. But we are alarmed at the rapid pace of how the work is moving, and we don't want to miss opportunities for it to be done in a way that's going to be lasting, right? So that we don't have to come back in another few years and sort of revisit it. So the Office of Racial Equity remains at your service, and we, Madam Chair, to answer your question, how much time do we want in your next meeting? Really all of it. I want all your time. I want all your time because those remaining aspects of your charge are of such incredible importance, and we have to get that part right.
Emily.
Thank you so much for being here. We've really spent all of our time on the first piece of our charge and no time at all really on 2, 3, and 4. And I really appreciate all of your suggestions. And so I think even if we spent the rest of our time on 2, 3, and 4, we'd actually still be giving a really significant short shrift. Anyway, not paying enough attention. And so I'm curious about your suggestions for us to really just like fully pivot from our charge of doing 2, 3, and 4 and what we could just recommend as reasonable next steps for 2, 3, and 4, given that we are not able to sort of fulfill the charge in a way that is what the charge deserves and what Vermonters deserve.
Yeah, thank you, Representative. I do agree with you, even if we dedicated the entire next meeting and then even another bonus meeting, I don't think that it would be really enough for that conversation. And I'm recalling earlier in today's hearing when you said you talked to Catherine, was it, or Christine? Excuse me for not remembering. Kath, yeah, about you said we tend to think globally about dollars instead of globally. I wrote it down. I'm reading. Think globally about dollars instead of globally about impacts. We only talk about impacts in the micro, not the macro. And I think this is also a really good example of that sometimes we look at equity sort of on this commission, and we're doing it piecemeal and not really understanding the full landscape. So in terms of your actual question, which is other suggestions that could be implemented right away, some of the things that you may want to look at might be things like compensation structure. So even aside from the conversation about the amount of the per diems, we can think at least about delivery method and who's included and who's excluded. For example, W-9s being required from people might mean that you're not getting the perspective of people who are unbanked or who don't have social security numbers, etc.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm actually not asking for explicit things we can do right now. I'm saying, do you have a suggestion on how we can essentially design the next committee to look at 2, 3, and 4? Our recommendation is that we are not prepared to answer 2, 3, and 4. We think this future committee that is made up of these people and has 12 public hearings in each of our counties should focus on 2, 3, and 4. So really like a full pivot and giving the responsibility to folks who might be better able to do it.
So here are some suggestions I have for that. Number 1, not to limit the number of people who can serve. Number 2, not to limit the number of meetings they can have or the durations of those meetings. Number 3, not to limit the dollar amount in per diem. So for example, we might say, oh, you can have as many meetings as you want, but this is how much money we're going to pay in per diems. But if we know there's a fixed rate for per diems, then we're effectively telling them how many paid meetings they can have without saying it. So I would remove all of those caps only because the purpose of this next phase committee would precisely be to figure out how to address some of these things that are causing challenges. So we don't want to put those same burdens on that group. So those are 3 initial things I would do. Number 4, I would consider the timeline not based on when the legislative calendar operates, but what the actual need is of the underlying work, because oftentimes committees and reporting deadlines are shaped based on the legislative calendar. And I get that you all are legislators, so that's what makes sense from your vantage point, but it can be very restrictive for people who feel like they're scrambling to do work because they're expected to adhere to a reporting cycle that may not necessarily give adequate time. I think also if we're talking about budgeting for this kind of committee work and community outreach, then we should budget not just for compensating the members themselves, but also for the costs associated with holding community events. So that might mean things like if you have to rent the cafeteria at a local school. Now, generally the schools in Vermont waive rental fees for state government usage, but the idea would be whatever costs are associated with it. Maybe you want to serve refreshments because you're doing evening meetings for the community. That's the kind of thing that is considered an emerging best practice for people to be able to find a way to compensate people for their time, or at least make it easier to engage with government. Another thing that I would recommend is building in enough time for that next level committee to be able to translate materials ahead of time. It's one thing to put out the call and speak only to English speakers, but it's another thing to build in that extra 2 to 3 weeks so that we can give public facing materials to our interpreters and translators around the state, and for them to be able to turn around those documents. And then for that committee to say, hey, we're hosting public listening sessions. If you're going to need an interpreter, then let us know and we can arrange for one. And of course, all of that does come at a cost as well. So thinking about the timeline and the cost of things like translation ahead of time is going to be really important. And then I think the last thing that I would say on that point, and there's a whole lot, I mean, obviously this list isn't exhaustive, but I think the last thing that I would say on that point is to consider membership on such a committee that is different than the membership we're accustomed to. Now, right before I had to leave, one of you was asking Will a question about the difficulties of finding new and different people who represent different vantage points and demographics. And so I would encourage us not to go to the same roster of people who are recently retired from state government, or the same 12 brown people who are on everything, or include more youth, right? Include more neurodivergent people. I think that if we're really talking about community engagement, I want to hear more from the people who have not been engaged than I do from the people who I always hear from. I'll stop there, but those are just some initial things that we can think of that would be really helpful in considering what that next phase could look like.
Thank you, Susanna. I 100% agree with you on everything you've said, and I wish that we had 3 more meetings out front that we could just focus on these issues. I think we all do. Our problem is something that we knew from day one was going to be a problem, because when we looked at what we were supposed to accomplish in 3 meetings, we understood that, and right away went to leadership to say, hey, do you think we could do a few more meetings? And it's just not possible for us to get to 2, 3, and 4. It'll have to be truly focused on first out by our House and Senate government operations committees. And leadership asked that we try and spend at least 1 meeting talking, just getting exactly what you just said, sort of a list of where to begin. Where can the government operations committees begin in doing this very extensive research, hear from the community, really understand these issues? They're so, so important, and probably shouldn't have been sort of put together with the number 1 question that's on there. It should have been a whole separate summer government or a summer committee. And unfortunately, that isn't the way it was done. And I apologize for that for the body. But I'm not sure now that we're going to be able to come up with the time. So instead, we're going to have to really make sure that we get the message to our government operations committees how important that hearing this information, as well as hearing from the public, maybe having public hearings through in a way that you have suggested, is where they should begin. Since we began on number 1, it'd be nice if they could begin on number 2. I don't know what more to say other than we just really do have 1 more meeting that we can talk about all of this. And I'm thinking that, are you thinking 2 hours or so, 2 to 3 hours would work? And would you bring in these other groups, or do you want us? How would you like to move forward with that 1 meeting?
Yeah, so I think that 2 to 3 hours would be beneficial. And what I can envision is that you would hear from me and potentially from 1 or maybe 2 other members of my team during a portion where we would present to you about considerations you should make and concrete recommendations that you can think of. We'll also provide a good bibliography for you for any further exploration you'd like to do. In terms of hearing from others, I strongly, strongly recommend that you hear from others. And that can be done in ways that don't have to take place during meetings. For example, you could set up an online form, a feedback form, disseminate it widely, ideally translate it. And that way you can hear from people without having to convene the committee for meetings and still be able to get feedback. That's another way that in the next few weeks you can maximize that time so that you don't just have a bunch of downtime. The next thing that I would say for that meeting is in terms of hearing from people, I'm happy to collect comments and input from community orgs and community partners that we're aware of. But I think that it would be more meaningful in a few ways if the committee sought those voices out and coordinated directly with them. So I'm happy to provide a list of people who I would suggest that you start with. But I do think that you all probably as a group should do some of that legwork. And one of the things that you might hear from others is the question about why you're limited to the number of meetings you're limited to. And I think that it's going to be important to distinguish between how many meetings are allowed versus how many compensated meetings there are. So we have a lot of people serving on boards and commissions who do the work without being paid, and they're expected to continue to. And so I think others may likely raise the question to you of, how much solidarity do you show with some of those people who are working uncompensated for state boards and commissions? So that's neither here nor there, but I would like for you all to anticipate that, because I certainly hear it all the time in the various committees that I sit on, and I think that people are really ready and eager to confront some of these questions and to have this conversation. I'll say this last thing. I think that Vermont is in a place where we are still small enough that we probably, as a state, cannot sustain a budget to pay what everyone ideally should be making for this kind of work, or to hire everybody as full-time staff. But we are too big as a state to continue relying on people's volunteer work to do hard-hitting government policy. So it's a very awkward position, because we're too big to continue the way we have been, but I don't think that we're quite at an economic place yet where we can cover everything we need to be covering, and that's difficult. So I don't envy you, but I am available to you.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you. Others? No, Senator Bradford. Okay.
Just, yeah, I'm sorry we didn't think about it sooner. I'm glad that you came today. Especially just when you think about what the state does, because a lot of our work is vulnerable people. I mean, I'm just thinking about people who are incarcerated. We should possibly hear from them, at some point. You are very familiar with the healthcare, and there are some people who really, it's difficult for them to share their experience. So thank you for reminding us and getting here just in time, I guess, which is not the way it should have been. So thanks.
All right. Thank you all for having me. I'll make sure that my remarks today get submitted to the committee assistant, and we will also look out for the committee's next steps, and we'll hold a date for your next meeting.
Okay, and I think you were going to also try and get some dates that you are available to Lindsay so that we can start from there. And I do think Emily has a,
Yeah, I think we're profoundly unprepared to even attempt to answer these questions or to even hear from folks about these questions. And I think we would be best meeting the needs of folks living in Vermont and serving on boards and commissions and people who are interested in and all of it, if we admitted that fully and said, we think the next step for 2, 3, and 4 is a comprehensive public participation process that is taken on by another committee, and not the GovOps committee, but a committee made up of, public and legislative members, or maybe, something like that. And like, that's where we put our limited time. in structuring the folks who are actually going to think about this a little bit better, rather than attempting to really think about the big picture ourselves and give it, not enough time no matter what.
I agree. I think that that's an excellent idea.
Okay.
And because I am concerned that we're not going to do justice to this work. Even if we all give a lot of time, as you know, all of us as legislators sit on a million committees in our communities as well, trying. And so it's not just that we don't want to do it, it's that we haven't planned for it. So we don't even really have the time to get it done between now and January 15th.
Can I just
That's-
say one quick thing?
Yes,
I'm
absolutely.
listening, and there's a part of me that is very wary that we're just kicking the can down the road. And I want to ensure that we don't do that. And before I'm comfortable signing off on another committee sort of taking care of something that we missed, I would like to make sure that committee is going to exist and know that it's going to be there and fulfill this very, very important task, which is community involvement and really looking at equity. So I'm throwing it out there. This is my own opinion. I'm not comfortable just saying we're only going to focus on one and then hope someone else picks up on 2, 3, and 4 in a way that is comprehensive and inclusive and equitable. So that's just my opinion. I'm just throwing it out there.
And I'm not sure exactly what to say, other than we talked about this at the first meeting, that with 3 meetings, we had to think about this ahead of time. We clearly have a different look today, and that's, I don't know what to say, except we've got to put our heads together and think about how to fix this and make sure that it gets the attention it deserves. Absolutely agree on that point.
Well, I think the thing that we have to understand is based on where we are right now and the state of the clock and the calendar, that we're not going to do justice to items 2, 3, and 4 in one more meeting in which we devote 2 hours to it. It's just not going to happen. It physically is impossible. So the question then becomes one of, well, what's the next step? And if the next step, or part of the next step in dealing with 2, 3, and 4 is that we address the items in 2 and 3 and 4 thoroughly, equitably, and we have appropriate community participation, and that is participation of all Vermonters, not just particular special interest groups affecting Vermonters, that we do this separately. Now, one of the ways to do it is as a recommendation to continue the work of this committee to be able to do those other things at some point in the future and then devote enough time, meeting time and resources to do that. I think that's very possible. I don't know that it's necessary to create yet another committee to do it. One of the purposes, one of the objectives of a lot of the work that we're doing right now is to prevent the proliferation of more and more and more committees.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that I don't think I'm at all supportive of doing at this point.
Exactly.
But if this was a charge that we have appointed, we have to have sufficient time to be able to do that. And that time is not between now and the beginning of the session. There isn't enough time to do justice to it.
So let's at least move forward we have a meeting, and that'll be after Thanksgiving. We'll spend some time. I will also take on connecting, Susanna, with you on the community piece. So let's talk about that. Some sort of questionnaire. It sounds interesting, even though I'm terrible at IT, but let's see what I can do to be helpful. And then I think we all need to think about this a little more and try and figure out how do we move forward in a way that it does justice to all 4 bullets. So thank you for being here.
Thank
Helping
you
us
for
out.
Thanks, Susanna.
Okay. It's 3:30. After 3:30, what are we gonna do about the recommendations?
Do you want to do a Zoom call?
I guess we're gonna have to do that. We don't
Let's
really.
just do a Zoom call. That way we haven't had the time to do it. And I'm going to come back to Montpelier to do it.
And are you saying a quick Zoom, like a Zoom call for just this and
To
then
follow,
have
yeah, to
another?
follow up these things here.
Okay,
that
and then we would have another long meeting.
Yeah, and then we have
We
another
still
long
have
meeting in
the fourth
December.
meeting, yes. So we'll have a,
And it's not that during that meeting that we can't begin to address, or at least hear some of the
Yeah.
things that Susanna has raised to us. That we certainly do.
Can we have a really quick turnaround on the doodle? Like all promise to each other that we will respond to the doodle within 6
That's
hours?
exactly what I was gonna say, Rep. Kornheiser. It's just, yeah, let's turn it around and let's have a Zoom call. Let's set up our regular long meeting and let's set up, I think, a fast turnaround time for when we meet next on Zoom.
Is there
And sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, yeah, is there any chance, if everyone has a calendar with them, is there any chance that there's some time on Monday that we would have to do?
Monday,
No, it looks.
I don't have a single minute the entire day.
Okay, and the 7th, which is Tuesday, I don't have a second the entire day, but Wednesday, does anyone have any time on Wednesday?
Wednesday is the 8th of November.
The 8th of November, yeah.
I have time between noon and 3. And that's it.
Okay,
All day long, Joint Information Technology Oversight Committee.
okay, so that
No,
doesn't work.
that's a Joint Legislative Management Committee.
Okay, how about Thursday?
Thursday the 9th, I'm open right now.
I
Okay,
could do the morning only, but I'm available from 8 until 12:15.
okay, others?
I could do the morning. No, not
I
yet.
could do between 8 and 10:30.
Okay. Others?
Thursday morning, the 9th.
Mhm.
Yeah. What if we did 8 to 9:30?
Totally works for me.
Sure.
8 to
Oh my
9.
God. Did we make a plan that fast?
Oh my gosh.
I can't
Is Tanya
believe it.
not on this committee anymore?
Oh, yeah, Tanya too.
Tanya
She
too.
couldn't make it today, so I'll check in with her. Maybe we could.
Can you send a calendar invite
It's on the calendar, Zoom information and.
right now?
And send it to you guys as well.
And what did we say, 8 to 10:30, is that right?
8 to 9:30.
9:30 or 10:30?
9:30. I had
Nine, she said
9:30. I think an hour and a half should be.
Okay, great.
Does it work?
So let's just all come in like guns blazing, sorry, wrong thing to say,
Yeah.
ready with notes and just hit the ground running.
Yes,
And we'll just be doing this. We're not doing.
just doing,
Can we share our notes in advance?
sure, how would we do
I'm
that?
not
'Cause
gonna
we
have time to get
we
my
don't want,
notes.
we don't want to include them in advance because we want to all agree on them. So bring them with you and share them to the group.
Yeah, I was just trying to find a way to make it fast.
Yeah.
Like a Google Doc or something.
That's forum.
It's a forum.
Yeah.
That's all.
Okay. Okay,
Public thingamabob, that's my technical legal term.
So Thursday,
Okay.
8 to 9:30.
8 to 9:30 Thursday, and then look for a poll on when are we going to meet right after Thanksgiving to,
For a full day.
for a full,
And then
yeah,
turn
for
it around
pretty
as
much a
fast as
full
possible.
day.
Okay. Sweet.
Okay.
Good to see everybody. We'll all see you
Thank-
next week.
Right.
You too, Josie.